Hello, welcome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jaybe show on Revolutionary Blackout Network. I am your host, James Fauntleroy. So good to see all of you here on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. Hello, good to see you. The JB show is every single Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern on RBN. So make sure to tune in there. I also have my own channel called the JB Font channel that is on every single Tuesdays at 2. If you guys would like to, you guys can also tune in on my channel as well. I also linked in the chat, by the way. So good to see all of you here. Also, just to let you guys know, if you guys would like to, you guys can also go to our Substack. You guys go to revolutionaryblackout.substack.com to get email notifications for our streams. Also, thank you so much to all the patrons on Patreon, as well as the people who donate to our GoFundMe. And also, thank you to everybody who also donates to our to Aaron, who is our graphics designer. You guys can go to Venmo at Revolutionary Blackout or Cash App $Mutual Aid Forever. Yeah, today is not my day, but please make sure to do that if you guys love the graphics that Erin does. She does an amazing job, as well as doing clippings for our live streams. So thank you so very much to Erin for that. Now, as per usual, when I have a guest, I typically go to the comments afterwards, but I just want to bring in my guest. My guest is from the Midwestern Marx Institute and is also an instructor for the Midwestern Marx Marxism course and author, Carlos Garrido. Good to see you, Carlos.
Good to see you, brother. Thank you for having me on, and happy Father's Day to all the fathers watching, and to all the mothers who play a father role as well. I wanted to congratulate you guys and specifically Jay for the work that he was doing yesterday in Skid Row, handing out pizzas in the community, continuing the legacy of the great Black Panther Party. And I wanted to also congratulate you guys on the role that I hope you will be playing with the Cornel West campaign, holding him accountable and making sure that he follows through on his promises and hopefully changes some positions, some troubling positions that I think both RBN and the Midwestern Marx Institute find somewhat troubling, but changeable and not irreconcilable with the other parts of his wonderful and exciting campaign. So thank you for having me on, brother.
Oh, thank you so much, and happy Father's Day to you and all the fathers out there as well.
Thank you.
Um, you know, I was kind of nervous because I was just like, it's Father's Day. Will he come on? So I was like, I don't know. I was like, all
I've
the
been
dads out there should be taking the day off, but here's Carlos teaching the people once again.
Yeah, well, I've been trying to stay away from drinking, so I didn't go on a bender last night, so I feel fresh today. I feel good. I'm ready to
That's
go.
that's good. So just to let everybody know what we're going to be talking about today, I have two different story. Still have a story that I'll be talking about afterwards. Now, if you would like to stay for the story, that's fine, but you're not required to. But we're going to be talking about the Cuban truth. And we're talking about myths about Cuba and what the truth is, about Cuba and how we can actually benefit from it. And then I'm also going to be talking about justice for Mykaella Sharlman. This is a story that has came out within the last week. More developments about it, so I'll be talking about that as well. And really, this actually just kind of coincides with why we need to change the system and why it is so important that we have these types of conversations. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, as far as Cuba goes, a lot of times people go, well, they're under a dictatorship. And one of the things that I learned is that Cuba has a very vibrant democratic process. If you can kind of go over that just a little bit, so that people realize that in many ways, and maybe it's just me, but it feels like Cuba has more of a democracy than we do.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful question, and I like the way you frame the discussion as the truth about Cuba. And um, I think just in terms of how we think about truth, we can perhaps start the distinction there, because for many of the commentators on Cuba, specifically from the Belly of the Beast, and from those from the Cuban diaspora who try to monopolize the sentiment that Cubans feel about Cuba, the way that the Cuban truth is approached is on a very superficial level, right? They take certain facts about Cuban reality right now, certain necessities that it has, certain forms of poverty that exists, and they say this is a result of socialism. This is the essence of Cuba. This is what socialism has done to my great country that before the revolution my parents were living so well in. And they remove all of the context, right? All of the contradictions, the development, and uh, they're unable to look at things from the perspective of Cuba as a social totality embedded in a world dominated by global capitalism and imperialism, and they're unable to see the plurality of factors that are the conditions for the possibility of allowing that fact that they're looking at to be there. And so the question of truth must be approached from the lens of the whole, right? What's the Cuban trajectory been like? What's Cuba's relationship to American imperialism? What are some of the difficulties that have been presented to Cuba? What are their sources, et cetera, et cetera? As far as the question of democracy, maybe we can hit on the other part later. But as far as the question of democracy, it is without a doubt that Cuba is far leaps ahead, more democratic than the U.S. or than any other liberal bourgeois democracy, um, and even in its own terms, right? So, the terms of what constitutes democracy in the West, it's usually in the capitalist West, is usually reduced to elections and electoral participation, et cetera, et cetera. In Cuba, you have much more uh, participation in elections. They're much more frequently. The percentage of the population that participates in them is often regularly 30 to 40% higher than those who participate in American elections. And if you look at municipal elections and you compare them to like US local elections, in the US, there's anywhere from 70 to 80% of people not participating in those. In Cuba, it's the vast majority of them who are.
Mm-hmm.
So, even in terms of like the bourgeois capitalist notion of what constitutes democracy, the ability to participate in elections and for the people through elections to elect their representatives, it is far, far more democratic in those terms. But I think, however, as Marxists, as socialists, we should adapt ourselves to rethinking the concepts that are used in a more quotidian sense by our societies. And we have to rethink what democracy itself is.
Yeah.
And I think we can go to the roots of this word, which is demos and kratos. Demos means the people, the common folk, not just Wall Street billionaires, the common folk, and kratos means power. And so democracy, when you bring it together, is power of common people, the
Yeah.
power of the people. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very clear, very, very clear. And, bourgeois institutions, Ivy League schools repeat this conclusion after countless studies that the US is nowhere near that.
Mm-hmm.
That in terms of who decides what gets done and what doesn't get done and who gets elected and who doesn't is more than 99% of the times determined by the interest of the monopoly classes, by money. It's not determined by the people. The people can want something very, very badly, and if the oligarchs not want it, it doesn't get passed. And the people can protest against something very, very strongly, and if the oligarchs want it, it will get passed. And what's democracy there? Yeah, you have the electoral stuff, people going to the booth every 2 to 4 years, but what's the substance of democracy there, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Cuba, that's not the reality. In Cuba, the people feel represented by their government. The approval ratings are very highly, and it's genuinely the people that are in power because the government itself, the state, the institutions do not exist for the sake of suppressing labor and upholding the interests of capital, as they do in our country, which is what we would call in scientific terms a dictatorship of capital. The will
Yeah.
that prevails is the will of capital and the personified agents of capital, which we call capitalists. In Cuba, it's a dictatorship of labor, a dictatorship of the people, which means that it is the people that govern, and so it's qualitatively a different, richer, broader, more profound form of democracy.
Hmm. You know, because just for the audience, because a lot of times, like somebody like myself, like a couple years ago, would come on a stream like this, and I'd be kind of confused at some of the lingo. And so when we say bourgeois, you're pretty much talking about the business owners, the big business owners, the corporatists, as they say. And so, really, instead of having a country that is dominated by the owners of these corporations, these billionaires and millionaires, it is actually the person who's the barista that has a say, the person who works in construction, the truck driver, the person the custodian that's cleaning the toilets. They have just as much as a say as anybody in the country, including people who are disabled, who are jobless like myself. They also have just as much of a say as anybody else within this system. And one of the tidbits of information that I found out about Cuba, and I don't know if you remember a few months back, but I put out a tweet and it got some traffic. But one of the things I said was, why don't we lower the age of voting to 16? And a lot of people were like, oh my God, you want 16-year-olds to vote? I'm like, well, if they are able to drive the 4,000 pound projectile in the streets next to me and make that judgment when it comes to driving their cars, then yes, they absolutely do also have a say in how our country is ran. Because guess what? They're literally driving on our streets. And in Cuba, you are automatically registered to vote at 16, which I'm like, that's a great idea. Because if they are able to have all these different things, as far as as far as they get to operate within the system, at the capacity that they have, then of course they should have a say. And also 16-year-olds work. No taxation without representation, right? So if you have 16-year-olds in Cuba that can vote and they're working and they're getting their taxes taken out of their check, well, why not here? But for some reason, we tend to devalue our young people in this country. Whereas in places like Cuba, if you're 16-year-old and working, you are valued, which is interesting, So if you want to speak on that, but I just thought it interesting how you're automatically registered.
Right, and just the general culture of voting. I'm sure you know, but when you go up to the polls, you have the people that control the polls, that overwatch and that manage the whole voting process, are pioneros, which are young Cuban students. So from a very early age, what we would consider here middle school, late elementary, you have kids that are involved in the voting process, getting in touch with the community, learning the importance of popular participation in these frequent elections which take place in Cuba. And yeah, of course, they're able to vote from very early on, and that's that's fundamental. And the voting, like it's you know not just at the federal level, but at local levels in the U.S., like the options that you have for voting are controlled, right? They're controlled by the two dominant parties in the U.S., which are both imperialist, bourgeois, and fascistic party. One that paints a liberal, or what some would call woke, veneer on top of their fascism. The other one which does it. And those are the two options that you get consistently with candidates. In Cuba, that's not the case. The people that are candidates are selected by the community. There's no party politics in that form, where it's bourgeois parties, the parties of this class that owns the means of production, that owns capital, that owns the big enterprises. You don't have that in Cuba. It's the people that are elected, and that guy that from that video, he talks about himself being elected for for a position when he didn't run. He was just, I think, a writer, a local writer, and the people liked him. They felt like he's the sort of person with the character that could put the interests of the people forward, and they elected him. And that often happens to the people that are like the most capable workers in their areas. I know my grandfather, that happened to him a couple times, and so it's an extremely popular and direct political democratic process.
So let me ask you this, because I just want to clarify. When it comes to people who are citizens in Cuba, are you called to serve in office like jury duty? Like, you don't personally say, "Oh, I'm going to run." It's more like, "Yeah, we choose you," kind of like a Pokemon reference, but we choose you to be our representative. Now, you can say yes or no, but if you say yes, then it's not because you wanted to do it. It's because the people wanted you. Am I getting that
Right.
correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And I mean, there's people that want to do it, and in order to do it, they need to show themselves capable of doing the job by serving the community, being
Wow.
capable of being seen in the eyes of the community as someone who can represent them. But it's just it's leaps and bounds ahead of anything we conceive of as democracy in the U.S. And when you hear these smears from U.S. pundits and with what Jose Marti, the apostle of the revolution, called gusanos de corbata, worms with bow ties. That's why we call in a derogatory fashion uh, parts of the exile community that are anti-Cuba and anti-communist. We call them gusanos today. Um, when you hear these people talk about Cuba as a tyranny or an authoritarian government or a dictatorship, it's just completely absurd. It has nothing, not the slightest bit of totalitarianism. It's an extremely democratic form of government, and the only interest to which it would appear as if it's a dictatorship or authoritarian are the interests of capital. And so when you have an understanding of democracy and freedom that's tied to the freedom of capital and democratic rights of different sections of the capitalist class to choose what pundits and what puppets are going to put forward for the next 2 to 4 years, when that's your understanding of democracy and freedom, of course, Cuba, there's no freedom and no democracy. But when your understanding of democracy and freedom is rooted in the people and an understanding of the people actually determining their own future and participating in self-determination and being an active process of the construction of their everyday life, then Cuba is you just can't compare it. So this is one of those things that it perhaps requires a more philosophical approach because these people love talking about democracy and freedom.
Hmm.
But Cuba also talks about democracy and freedom. But what we have to understand is that there's two types of freedoms. The freedom that they refer to here and the democracy that they refer to here is tied to capital. It's bourgeois capitalist democracy and capitalist freedom. It's the freedom to accumulate, the freedom to have the mass of the population exploited and oppressed for the sake of accumulating the capital that's in the hands of a very small number of society. In Cuba, that freedom is negated. That freedom, which inflicts on the freedom of others to live flourishing lives as human beings, that freedom is abolished. And so, from that standpoint, they're anti-freedom, right? But they're anti their freedom, the freedom of their capital, not they're the most in favor of human freedom as you can possibly be.
Well, it kind of goes in line with the whole tolerance tolerance argument. People say, well, you have intolerance accepts all, is tolerant of everything, and it's like, no, the only thing that tolerance is unacceptable of is intolerance. So if you have an ideology of intolerance, then therefore tolerance will not tolerate it. You know what I mean? And so it's the same thing in that same vein is when it comes to, and somebody told me this years ago. They said true freedom does not encroach upon the rights of others. But if that right that you have encroaches upon other people's freedoms, well, then that's not really a freedom. So, like for instance, when it comes to these corporations and these oligarchs, these big business types want to encroach upon our freedoms by using the government as their tool to take our freedoms away. Well, they're not for freedom. They're actually for tyranny. It's just they mask it as freedom. You know what I mean? And so that's what it feels like to me when it comes to a lot of the Western nations like the United States. You can add that to the UK. And people will make excuses for countries like like Norway, Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, and say, well, they're social democracies. They're a nice, happy medium between capitalism and socialism. It's like when people talk about a happy medium between capitalism and socialism, I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to give you, fecal matter, to eat. But if I take a little bit of fecal matter and put it on your sandwich, I mean, it's just a little bit of fecal matter on your sandwich. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's not a full shit sandwich. It got just a little bit of shit in it. Is that okay? Are you still going to eat it? And I'm like, just a little bit of imperialism. Is that okay? Is that fine? Just a little bit of colonialism, just a little bit of austerity is okay. So that it kind of sorry, it's just
Right.
I'm just the hamster's running the wheel in my head. So when people talk about oh well, why does Cuba have to be so they have to be so militant, in their socialism, in their communist beliefs? My question is, well, why are we compromising, the will of the people for that? Why would we be so willing to do that?
Right. And I mentioned when we first started that really to understand the truth of Cuba, you need to have like a to understand it. I think concretely, comprehensively, you need to have a view of the Cuban trajectory, if you wish. Cuba is a country that, like most places in the Americas, was colonized in the late 15th century. It was colonized by the Spanish. And what ensued was, as usual, the genocide of native peoples, the bringing over of African peoples to be enslaved and to work in plantations. And then in the late 18th century, Cuba becomes the sugar hub of the world,
Yeah.
which means that the vast majority of its land begins to be used for the sake of producing what was for it the most profitable commodity, was for the Spanish colonists the most profitable commodity, which was sugar and a little bit of tobacco as well.
Yeah.
And so you have the situation where you have a forced colonially forced monocropping on sugar on of sugar on Cuban lands, and this goes on for the next 200 years up until the revolution. And what does that do to the Cuban soil? Well, the what you see today is that 75% of Cuba's otherwise arable land is affected by soil erosion. So those are things that the revolution inherits that has nothing to do with socialism, but they're difficulties that they have to deal with.
True.
Because if they continue down the route of we're only going to produce sugar, their economy will continue to be as it's been for the last since the late 18th century, dependent on global fluctuation of sugar prices. So when sugar's doing good in the international market, the elites in Cuba were doing a little well. When it's doing bad, they're not. So you have that dependency on the monocropping of sugar that the
Mm-hmm.
revolution inherits. And then you have a dependency on trading it with the US, because starting from 1865, 65% of Cuban exports and trade is going to the US, which of course is 90 miles north from Key West. So it's the natural geographical trading partner that Cuba has as the largest power in the Western hemisphere to trade with. So
Mm-hmm.
these conditions then develop and intensify after the Cuban Revolutionary War at the turn of the 20th century. The U.S. gets involved through some yellow journalism. It actually tries to buy Cuba in the mid 1890s, and Spain rejects it. But it gets involved in the Cuban Revolutionary War, ends up occupying Cuba for 3 years. The condition that it sets for leaving Cuba is the Platt Amendment, which basically makes it so that the U.S. has the capacity to come back and occupy Cuba at will whenever it feels like its economic interests in the island are being threatened. Because again, the vast majority of Cuban resources and production was in the hands of American multinational companies. So
Yeah.
the U.S. state, as a instrument of these oligarchs and these monopolists, obviously has a vested interest in sustaining the condition that Cuba was in, its neo-colonial imperialized condition. Um, and it's a condition where the vast majority of Cubans were extremely, extremely poor. A very small amount that played the role of a sort of managerial class, the bow tie worms that Marti used to talk about. They lived very well, and Havana was known as Sin City. It was the Vegas before Vegas, and that's the memory
Mhm.
that a lot of the people that are in Miami, who came very early on and whose family fled with the revolution. That's the memory of Cuba that they have. So in their heads, Cuba was a paradise. But the question is, who was it a paradise for? It was a paradise for a very small percentage of specifically white Cubans, and it was a paradise for American capitalists and capitalists from other nations that came and had their way with Cuban women, because there was vast prostitution that went to the casinos and lived the Vegas life. So it's the revolution, which really it starts moving and getting started with the 26th of July movement around 1953. It finishes, or it grabs power in 59. That's when it really starts. But it's a completely popular uprising. It's a popular uprising. I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but Fidel comes with 72 other people on a boat called the Grama. Um, they land, and as soon as they land, they get attacked. The group splits into two. It's reduced to like a couple dozen people, and somehow in that condition, they're still able to win the war. How they do that? Well, because they were able to solidify the people, and the people saw their interests represented by this revolutionary movement, the 26th of July. So it's a deeply popular movement. And what ends up happening is that as soon as it grabs power, the main concerns are giving the resources and the land and the factories, making that which was producing riches for American corporations, uh, having all of that be invested in Cubans, right? A Cuban land and Cuban produce and Cuban work and all of that for Cubans and not for American capitalists. And so you begin to start the process of nationalizing lands in order to do land reforms and distribute land amongst the agricultural workers. You begin to nationalize companies, and one thing leads to another because the U.S. doesn't like these because these companies are American companies.
Yeah.
You begin to have sanctions here, sanctions there, and eventually, within a year, Cuba is forced to turn from its trading ally being the U.S. to the USSR. The full blockade comes into place, and from the beginning, they have been very open about the reasons for this blockade. If I may, real quick, read a short part from a memorandum from Lester Mallory, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter American Affairs. He wrote in 1960 that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy, that means the blockade, is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which will call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow a government. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenfranchisement and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So, what are they saying there? This is an extremely popular revolution. The people are on the side of the revolution and its government. The only way that we can change this reality is by strangling Cuba economically, right? Through a blockade that affects it not only from trading with its historical trading partner, which was the US, but because of the US's role as a global hegemon, from trading with all of the forces that are allied to the US's axis of evil, if you want to call it that. And
Mhm.
so, along with this is not just the blockade. You have a whole series of hybrid warfare that include anything from hundreds of assassination attempts against Fidel Castro's life.
Over
Uh,
600, right?
I believe, yeah, yeah. It's let me see. I have the statistics somewhere around here. Um,
Yeah, if I remember correctly,
yeah,
they
over
tried.
600.
Yeah,
Over
over 600
600
times.
CIA led unsuccessful attempts on Fidel's life. uh, 10 or so biowarfare attacks. Most famously, you have the 1971 CIA orchestrated African swine fever virus.
Uh,
You also have the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. You have the backing and funding of groups and individuals who partook in terrorist bombings. The archetypical case here is Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Garriles, who are perhaps the best known, specifically the latter's involvement in the 1976 bombing of Cubana Airlines Flight 455, which killed 73 people. And both of these figures are celebrated by the Miami exile community. They also planned in 1962 something called Operations Northwood, where the U.S. government was considering orchestrating a quote communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, so that they can then blame the Cuban government on these terrorist
Wow.
campaigns that they themselves were going to do, and use that to manufacture consent in the public in order to attack Cuba. But besides that, they don't. They not only do they have this blockade to bring about desperation, not only do they wage all of these different forms of warfare, hybrid warfare, because it takes many forms, but they also they don't allow the eruption of discontent to be left to chance. So, as Tracy Eden from the Cuba Money Project has shown, between the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which are the CIA's two new fronts, and the U.S. State Department, more than $1 billion has been given to Cuban opposition groups and media, both within Cuba and outside in the exile community. So these are taxpayer dollars that are going, a billion of them, to Cuba and to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And really, what were they able to create? To what has it been able to create? The moment where Cuba was the most desperate that it's might have ever been was on July 2021, where you have the pandemic. So the tourism industry, which is central for the Cuban economy, it has to be
Mhm.
shut down. You have pandemic-related difficulties, and then you have the difficulty of the blockade, which the Cuban thought process that was started by Obama was overturned by Trump and then sustained and amplified by Biden.
Mhm.
And so you have extreme difficulty in in this year, and you have in July 2021 a few uprisings that occur in various Cuban cities that maybe had at most a few thousand across the whole island. And this was projected by the American media and bourgeois media from around the world as a revolution that was overthrowing the uh, the tyrannous Cuban government, the authoritarian government. They were using pictures from like Egypt and pictures from pro-Cuban rallies. In Fox, they had Ted Cruz speaking, and in Fox, they had a picture of this Cuban rally, and they blurred the signs because when you unblurred them, what the sign said was "Las calles son de los revolucionarios." The streets are of the revolutionaries, and that was the anthem that was being said because after these uprisings of a few cats, a few thousand cats, President Diaz-Canel said revolutionaries hit the streets, and they scattered. You couldn't find them within 5 minutes because the vast majority of people that are with the revolution, by the millions, they hit the streets and they protested in favor of the government and against these fomented attempts that are driven by by American money, really, as Tracy Eden has shown. So they've done so much, and all they were able to do in terms of their attempted success at overthrowing the Cuban government was really get a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand cats to hit the street and then scatter as soon as Diaz-Canel said revolutionaries hit the streets. So they failed. They have failed. They have
Oh
famously, they've
God.
had 60 years to succeed in overthrowing the Cuban government, and they have failed. And all they're doing is causing unnecessary suffering, not just for the Cuban people, but as maybe we can get to later on, for the American people as well. Because Cuba is a socialist country that invests not for the sake of making profit for a small group of people, but for the sake of meeting the people's needs and making their lives better. They have a big chunk of their revenue invested in medicine and in education and in their national healthcare system. They've developed, vaccines and treatments for diabetes and cancer and HIV that are just tremendous and would save literally hundreds of thousands of lives a year in the US. And American people are dying because they don't have access to those treatments that have been developed in Cuba, and they don't have access to them thanks to the blockade. So it's not only affecting Cuba tremendously, but it's also affecting American citizens quite a bit.
Hmm. In fact, one of the things I do want to talk about, and I think this is also important, is some of the contributions that Cuba has really done, not just for their own people, but for the world. Everybody knows that Cuba has great healthcare. I mean, that was if you ever seen. I'm not sure if you ever seen it, but anybody in the audience, if you ever seen the Michael Moore documentary called Sicko, there was a part where they actually take a boat to Cuba and get their medications and get healthcare done for free in Cuba. And first of all, one of the things that people, if you are being ran by a tyrant, if you're being ran by a tyrannical government, having free healthcare, this doesn't make sense to me, because if you have a tyrannical government, you're not going to have free healthcare. What country doesn't have free healthcare? Oh, the United States. Anyway, so but one of the things that really tripped me out, I'm sorry, but I was tripping balls over this, was Operation Miracle. And a lot of people don't know about Operation Miracle. And I was like, what? When I found this out. And if you want to, you can explain it, but I also have articles that can explain it as well. But this is just amazing. If you would like to, or I can do it. Um,
Yeah, so you have a situation in Venezuela where Hugo Chavez gets elected. I believe it's in '99, and they have tremendous difficulties because all of the components that I talked to you about Cuba, the looting of their resources and the super exploiting of their people by primarily American multinational monopoly corporations, but also by other capitalists from the Western world, from the global North. These are themes that reappear in Latin America in general and in the Caribbean. So these are similar issues to the ones that Venezuela was facing. The vast majority of their people were illiterate. They did not have medical care, the capacity for medical care, and the same was the case for Cuban people before the revolution. And you have with Operation Miracle in 2004 the sending of Cuban doctors to Venezuela. And I forget the number of how many people were cured, but if I want to say it was in the hundreds of thousands or the tens of thousands of people were cured from their blindness. And it was called Operation Miracle because it is miraculous when you go from not being able to see from one day to another. And this is not an isolated event that was done just because Venezuela was socialist and Cuba wanted to show solidarity with the socialist nation. Cuba has, as the country that produces the most doctors per capita, they've been sending doctors around the world from the beginning of the revolution. And
mhm,
that's very telling because as soon as the revolution happens, there is a tremendous exodus of professionals, medical professionals, and medical teachers. And in the University of Havana alone, if I recall the statistic correctly, I think only 12 teachers stayed in the University of Havana Medical School. 12 teachers out of around 200 were the only ones that stayed after the revolution. Because professionals see their interests threatened by this popular revolution. They're part of the class that lives somewhat luxuriously in the imperialized country, so they fled to the US. And in the midst of this exodus of professionals, Fidel makes a comment in 1960, right when the revolution happens. He says Cuba will be a country of professional men and women. Che repeats similar comments, and this is absurd. They just lost their professional workforce, but they invested. They changed the structure of healthcare and the Ministry of Public Health and Education. They nationalized it so that it serves the need of educating people and developing them. They made it easier for people to get an education. They developed programs so that healthcare doctors and nurses could be developed easier. And, they did all of this. And as soon, within the first few years of the revolution, Cuba's sending doctors all over the world.
yeah.
And within a generation or two, it's got a tremendous surplus of doctors. And it's exporting the saying, as the saying goes, It's exporting doctors, not bombs.
Yeah.
And as Helen Yaffe, who's one of the leading scholars on Cuba, she writes that there's tens, if not hundreds, of millions of people around the world who can say that they owe not only their health but their lives to those efforts of Cuban doctors.
Yeah.
So it's just incredible. It's a national health system
Yeah.
that's tremendously planned at different levels. It's got short term, middle term, and long term plans. It's the approach to medicine, man. It's so different
It
from.
is. One of the things I want to say, and maybe you can coin this phrase. You can take it from me if you want. And it's like instead for Cuba, instead of having boots on the ground, they have lab coats on the ground.
Mm,
You know, and so I think that's it's like instead of having people that are trained to take a life,
yeah,
they're sending people who are trained to give a life. And it's crazy because it's like it just makes me imagine what if the United States had the same type of policy, foreign policy, of instead of boots on the ground, we put lab coats on the ground.
we can't
Imagine.
have that, and that's the thing that people we fight for, like Medicare for all, and I think we should fight for all of that. But when you
Mhm.
look at like the most profitable industries in the U.S.,
Yeah.
the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex, it's up there. It's up there amongst the most profitable, and
Yeah.
it's an industry that profits off of sickness.
Yeah.
And its role in American politics makes me think that in order to get even these moderate reforms that we would like, a
Hmm.
more radical transformation uh, of the country has to take place, because those people are not going to go down and let you just nationalize your health system from one day to the next when they're some of the most powerful moneyed interest in the country. So Cuba's able to do that again because it's a socialist society. It produces for the sake of meeting people's needs. Its government and its civil institutions are all aimed at uplifting people and not serving the interest of the capitalists and the interest of profit and capital accumulation. And what's very sad, I love that phrase. Instead of boots on the grounds, we send lab coats on the ground. And what's very sad is that the U.S. has, in a very despicable and disrespectful manner, claimed that the doctors are slaves. That's been the narrative of the empire. These doctors
Yeah.
are slaves of the Cuban government that are forced to do this in order for the Cuban government to, to gain goodwill from the international community and make money or something, which is, it's completely absurd because half of the missions are done for in the poorest corners of the earth are free, and the other half are done at a sliding scale. That means that they pay however much they're able to pay. And to call these people that are seen by the Cuban people as heroes, to call them slaves, and to degrade them in the way that the imperialist narrative does, is so extremely dehumanizing and disrespectful. But that's a common thread of the U.S.'s narrative, not just on Cuba, but on anyone who stands up to the interests of American imperialism. What we're seeing now with the narrative against Russia, it's such a despicable and dehumanizing narrative. And that's a constant thread. They do it against Venezuela. They do it against China. They do it against Nicaragua. Any country that stands up to the interest of monopoly capital, to the interest of U.S. imperialism, will be dehumanized as an essential component in manufacturing consent in the populace within the empire for these operations abroad.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, One of the things that I think is important is that uh, if we had a country, if Cuba was a country that was dictatorial, they would not be wanting people to have the opportunity to escape. You know what I'm saying? And if you are a doctor and what they say here in the West is true about them being slaves, then when they went to Italy back in 2021 to help out during the COVID crisis, why didn't some of them just miss their flight and stay in Italy?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But no, they chose to come back, you know. because the thing, and then they could have came out into the Western media and said, "Oh my God, we're slaves over there, and I can't go back. My family's there." Blah blah blah. They could have somebody could have came out and said something, but no, they are there really because it is a labor of love. And the crazy part is, they're not sowing a narrative that our U.S. military or personnel are slaves, even
Mm,
though they literally have to get into the military to have free healthcare. They have to get
right.
into the military to get housing. They have to go to the military to get education.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, once they get out of the military, they are subject to being left and abandoned by their own government. So the question is, who's the slave?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
They
the
have
thing
the
is,
highest
we're
suicide
going to
rate.
talk about it. We're going to talk about it. Let's
Yeah.
let's let's put all this shit on the table. This is RBN, baby. And the thing is that look, if you're in Cuba, like for instance, correct me if I'm wrong, is homelessness even a thing in Cuba?
No, no. The vast majority of the people own their homes. Now they're not in the best condition, because resources are scarce thanks to the blockade and
Mm-hmm.
the forced manner in which Cuba has to engage in international trade, where they're forced to sell at lower than market prices and buy at higher than market prices, so that it's worth for the people that they're trading with the sort of punishment that they'll get from the U.S. empire. But um, it's not ideal housing, and the same thing with food. It's not like they're able to eat like 7 meals a day or something. Not many bodybuilders in
Mm-hmm.
Cuba, but they have the basic necessities, and if one tries to do a hypothetical of what would happen if Cuba was oriented by capitalist market practices, and they had that scarcity of resources, there would be famines. There'd be mass homelessness because the few resources that exist would be bought up by the small class of people that has a lot of money. But that's not the case in Cuba. The government makes sure that the few that it has, that it's able to have because of the blockade, it's distributed equitably so that everyone has at least the basic necessities met. And then there's some people who have relatives abroad who can send them money and they can buy a little bit more. But everyone is guaranteed enough to eat. They're guaranteed housing. Housing is 90 something percent of the people own their housing. The people that don't, they pay a very, very small percent of their paycheck in the form of rents. So it's a completely different reality. And one of the things you find is that there's more people that when they come to the U.S. from Cuba, there's more people going back than the ones staying, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because they have this image. Unfortunately, especially now that social media is available, the empire creates this image of the U.S. as this land where everyone lives, like if it's Hollywood, and um, you know, uh, you see in certain vlogs of people that are funded by the Ned that are in Cuba. They ask people in the street, how do you think people in Miami live? And they're like, oh, everyone's got a pool, and all they do every day is like eat steak and drink beer. It's like, motherfucker, that's not even close to the reality of the vast majority of Americans. 60% of Americans are a lost paycheck away from homelessness, where they'd be joining the 600,000 homeless people that exist in this country, with 33 times as many empty homes as homeless people. So it's a very distorted reality that some, specifically younger people in Cuba, have, and so when of the U.S. And so when they come, they realize, wow, this isn't the image I was painted. And a lot of them, even though they admit that you can have a better material existence here, um, they go back. They go back because they don't have to stress about rent, about working 80 hours a week in order to pay for the basic necessities, about tripping out if you get sick because you don't have health insurance, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I was I don't I'm not I'm trying to I was trying to find it. It was either on TikTok or it was on Instagram, but there was this part of a speech from Michael Parenti. Now, we love Michael Parenti around here. Where he's talking about it was um, a a card. He was talking about um oh my god, it was this he's referring to story from this guy at Cuba.
Oh yeah, where
Where
he goes to the rural parts of Cuba, and the people there tell him, if we got sick, we'd have to walk maybe 2 days to get to the nearest hospital. Likelihood is that the person dies or something. Yeah.
well, yeah, that's another
Oh,
part.
the ration card. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the ration card. And a lot of times people were like, "Oh my God, you have the ration in these socialist countries," and I'm like, because Michael Parenti made the argument that we ration in the United States too.
Hmm.
The only difference is that instead of it being equal amongst everybody, is that the rationing goes the most towards the oligarchs and the billionaires and the millionaires, and then we get our little tiny pittance, right? And so it's the same thing here. Like, it's just, which rationing would you rather have? Would you have the rationing of these small microscopic minority of people having everything while we have very little, or having it equal across the board where everybody has the same? At least you're still alive, and at least you're still able to eat, and at least you're able to have your health care and things like that. So it's like, would you rather a little bit of people have more than everybody else while everybody else has very little, or everybody have the same? And then when we all can have an abundance, we all grow and have an abundance.
Mm.
But the thing is that people look at that and they go, "Well, oh my God, they didn't work for it." I'm like, neither did the billionaires. They didn't work for that. These capitalists, look, we're all working to make somebody else rich. I'm sorry, but that sounds like tyranny to me.
Oh yes, it is indeed. It is
You
indeed.
know?
Yeah, that's the Leninist question. Like,
Well,
who benefits? Who is doing the rationing, and for what sake? Right. And that gets at the question of who's in control of the things that are produced. In the
yeah,
U.S., it's the capitalists, and
yeah,
the reason why they produce, the end of which, the telos, is to accumulate capital, to get richer and richer and richer and richer and richer, and everyone else can stay poor. In Cuba, that's not the case. There is material difficulties, but if you aren't able to understand these within the context of the U.S. blockade, which has cost Cuba trillions of dollars in resources that it would have otherwise had it not been for the blockade. Let me see if I can find the specific statistic somewhere around here. Um, it's well, I can't seem to find it, but it's somewhere around 1.3, if I recall correctly, 1.3 trillion dollars. Um, yeah, 1.3 trillion dollars. And one of the case of Cuba is interesting because around the world, when the U.S. attacks a socialist country or a country outside of the sphere of influence of empire, generally, most of the world ends up tiptoeing to the U.S.'s line. That's not the case with Cuba. And for the last 30 years in the United Nations General Assembly, the vast majority of the world has voted
yeah,
in favor of lifting the US's blockade on Cuba. So we want to talk about democracy. Literally, the whole fucking world
yeah.
agrees that the US should lift the blockade on Cuba. And the last vote in November 2022, 185 countries voted in favor of lifting the blockade, and only two countries, the US, global imperial hegemon, and Israel, a racist, apartheid, genocidal state, are the only ones that voted in favor of sustaining the blockade. And it's completely absurd. And if I may just real quick speak to, in the case of medicine, just some concrete examples of what the blockade does. Because
Mhm.
people get an idea of like sanctions and blockade, and they think of it in a very fixed sense. Like if it's just this thing that once Cuba is able to figure out how to work around it, boom, it's good. The blockade is dynamic, right? As soon as Cuba figures out how to overcome something in one area, boom, here comes a restriction. So it makes planning extremely difficult because nothing is assured. Nothing is assured thanks to the influence of the U.S. But specifically in the case of medicine, the Cuba's Ministry for Public Health reports that Cuba has denied the right to acquire technologies, raw materials, reagents, diagnostic means, medicines, devices, equipment, and spare parts necessary for the best functioning of its national healthcare system, which must be obtained in geographically distant markets or through a third country with an increase in cost. Technologies from the US or with more than 10% components from the US cannot be acquired by the island, which has a negative impact on healthcare outcomes. In some cases, it is necessary to send patients abroad at a much higher cost than doing the procedure in national territory, even if the technology was available. For instance, from January to July 2021, the Medical Products Import and Export Company contacted 65 U.S. companies to inquire about the possibility of importing medicines, equipments, devices, and other supplies necessary for the care of the Cuban people through the national health system. Of these, 56 did not respond to the request by the Cuban entity, and 3 responded negatively, which were Owens and Minor Incorporated, Mercury Medical, and Eli Lilly. No surprises there. The Omeda, General Electric, and Hewlett Packard companies were asked for multi-purpose mechanical ventilators for newborns and infants, as well as for multi-purpose cardio monitors, which include blood pressure monitoring and other parameters. Its acquisition has yet to be made possible. They completely ignored the request. In the same way, the One Lambda company was asked for kits for HLA typing, and which are essential for determining the compatibility of a kidney transplant candidate with possible donors, and they could not be acquired either. There's around 158,000 patients that are harmed by the impossibility of assessing technology for the implantation of percutaneous valves, what are called TAVI valves. So I have a bunch of examples in the article if anyone wants to see them. I don't want to keep reading specific medical examples, but I go through like 2 pages worth of examples where technology, medicine, a variety of different things, Cuba just cannot get a hold of them because the places that produce them are blocked from selling them to Cuba by the influence of the U.S. And that's just in terms of healthcare. That's a study that I published earlier this year that was just looking at healthcare. It's the same in every other area of society, and it makes it extremely difficult to develop and provide what's necessary for its people. Even though it does that, it's still relatively poor. And socialism is not about poverty or making everyone equally poor. We want to increase the wealth of society so that everyone has more than enough in order to flourish as individuals embedded in community. And Cuba's not able to do that because of the blockade. And so that narrative that, the people that go to Cuba, they go to the poorest parts and they're like, oh, this is what socialism has done. That's complete bullshit. What socialism has done is ensure that with the little resources that they have, everyone is fed and no one's dying of hunger and no one's homeless.
Yeah, that it's heartbreaking because you have people who are like me who are on kidney dialysis that want to get a transplant in Cuba and they can't because of these sanctions and these blockades.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that they can't even improve their quality of life. And
Yeah.
that's what hurts because I'm trying to imagine myself, in Cuba trying to get on the transplant list. Like, look, I even had the application for the transplant list right here, right? And the thing is that, if I can't do it, then my quality of life, that I want to improve, it doesn't improve. And one of the things because I want to make sure that I get a couple of these other points in, is that when it comes to quality of life within countries like Cuba, and I know a lot of times we talk about, a lot of times people talk about, well, we don't want to focus too much on the identity politics and things like that. But this is a point where, and it's like I said a couple of weeks ago, because I was talking about pride and LGBTQ issues and how they intersect with class. One of the things that I actually talked about, and I want to share this, was that this was from the National Institute of Health. And this says Transsexuals' Right to Health, a Cuban case study. And it talks about how back in 2008, says Cuba's Minister of Public Health signed Resolution 126, an act that assured complete coverage for Cubans seeking sexual reassignment surgeries, also known as gender confirmation surgeries, the first of any country in Latin America to do so. So it comes to, even when it comes to quality of life for people who are queer or, trans, Cuba looks out for them even though Cuba can say, you know what, we don't really need to. But they did it anyway because they look at it as a medical issue. Because as many people hate to say it, people who are trans that get gender confirming or gender assignment surgeries, they are typically a lot happier. Their suicide ideation goes either down very low or goes away. And on top of that, their mental health improves. And so they're looking at it from a mental health, physical health type of view in Cuba. And you are actually able to get full health care if you're queer in Cuba, versus here in the United States, people have to raise money for their, gender affirming care, through GoFundMe and Give Butter and all these other different apparatuses. So, it just goes to show how even in Cuba, just through their revolutionary type of, you know, um, thought and mentality, that it really does actually help even who people will say, oh, that's identity politics. It's like, well, no, it's also a class issue that also affects people of different identities as well. And so this is something that this actually makes me feel like I actually would be more safer and more comfortable in Cuba than here in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. All of these issues are treated as you mentioned, as human rights issues, as things that human beings, irrespective of how they choose to identify, or irrespective of backgrounds, they're treated as human rights issues, no different than any others. And um, yeah, they just passed one of the most progressive, perhaps the most progressive constitution in the world. So they're definitely listening to their people, uh, and and expressing their people's will in as best a form as possible, precisely because it's actually a government of, by, and for the people. And that's the paradox. We say that we're for this, and we found our country on these values, but they've never been actualized because they're
Yeah.
fully incompatible with the capitalist mode of production. And it's important to note that, like, the U.S. the U.S.'s blockade on Cuba not only is tremendously harmful for Cubans,
Hmm.
who are very clearly not going to ever do what the U.S. wants, which is overthrow their government because they support their government. It's their government. But it's tremendously harmful for hundreds of thousands of Americans. As I kind of hinted at earlier, Cuba has developed um, its HIV treatment has been such that the World Health Organization praised it for setting the ground for a generation that's free of HIV transfers from mother to child. It's
Hmm.
also developed the CEMAVAX vaccine, which was developed at Havana Center for Molecular Immunology, and it acts on the growth factor of cancer cells to prevent the disease from spreading, specifically lung cancer. Um, Today, because of the U.S.'s blockade, thousands of Americans are deprived of the prolongation and enhancement of their lives, which the CEMAVAX vaccine would have provided. Similar to CEMAVAX, you also have the Racotumobab vaccine and the VSSP, which are both promising cancer drugs invented by this institute. Racotumobab targets a molecule that scientists believe is found in all cancer cells, meaning that the drug could one day be effective against leukemia and the tumors that accompany lung, breast, colon, and prostate cancers. And VSSP, which was originally designed as a compound to activate the immune responses to vaccines, also appears to stimulate the immune response against cancer. Besides the cancer research, they've again prevented the transmission. They've abolished completely the transmission of HIV from mother to child, and they have been praised even by the World Health Organization, the WHO, for it. And in terms of diabetes developments, they've developed the Heberprot P, which is being called the diabetes miracle treatment. So when uncontrolled diabetes damages the nerves and the blood vessels in a person's foot, it can cause one of the disease's most debilitating complications, diabetic foot ulcers, capable of penetrating the bone. These ulcers can even become gangrenous, and in the worst cases, can cause the amputation of a finger, a foot, or even a leg. Since 2006, Cuba has had a medicine for these ulcers called Herberbrot P, which avoids the need to amputate. Its inventors, scientists from the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in Havana, described this treatment as an epidermal growth factor that is injected next to the affected area and can accelerate the skin's healing process, closing the wound in about 3 months. It's shown an 80% success in preventing amputation, which is an incredible feat considering that up to 60% of amputations lead to death within 5 years and 80% within 10 years. In the US, as I'm sure the audience knows, diabetes is the seventh most common cause of death, affecting more than 1 in 10 adults, and prediabetes, 1 in 3. And each year, 1.4 million Americans are diagnosed with diabetes, and more than 100,000 of them die from the disease. If they had this Cuban treatment, we could reduce the risk of U.S. amputations in half, saving tens of thousands of lives a year. But this is prevented thanks to the blockade, which affects, again, not only Cuba and Cubans, but American people as well.
Wow. Woo, man. And as somebody, I have people who are diabetic in my family. This would be something that would be amazing to have available in the United States just in case. And they don't have it because of the blockade, because of the sanctions. You can't get these drugs here into the United States, you know?
That's what
Um,
I'm sure. I'm sure I told you this last time we spoke, but it was on your channel. But that's how I got radicalized. My mom had my sister. She developed fibromes within her, and they told her you either get the operation and are insured you're going to survive, or you roll with it, you might die. And and her thought process was, well, do I get this operation and end up with such medical debt that it just drowns the family, or do I just roll with it? And she decided to roll with it. And as a very young kid, all I had ever heard from my relatives and family friends was how horrible Cuba was and how it was a totalitarian government and authoritarianism and prisoners and all these political prisoners, all these bullshit that's baseless and lies. But I heard all of this. And then these same people told my mom, just go to Cuba and get the operation. I was like, what? That makes no sense. You live in what you've been boasting about your whole life as the richest and best country in the world that has a plethora of resources, but you're telling my mom to go to the poor country that's a totalitarian country. You're telling her to go there to get the operation when there's an abundance of resources for that operation here in the U.S. Like, what's going on here? And then it all started to make sense as I grew up and found out about the role of the commodification of medicine and private interest and profit and capitalism, etc. But that's what a lot of people are doing. They end up just going to Cuba to get treated. And those are people from the same Cuban diaspora, which love to shit on the government and talk about how much of a totalitarian hellhole Cuba is.
mhm. I got something too. I'm gonna show you. This was hilarious. All right, so I'm sure you probably seen this, but I heard of this article and this just I flipped out. It made me laugh. So this is out of the Miami Herald. It says thousands of Cuban exiles are exploring an unusual option, returning to Cuba to live. And it's it says although the 78-year-old from Guantanamo, Cuba, lives in his daughter and granddaughter, he's alone most of his time. So in July, he asked for Cuban government permission to return. And the thing is that a lot of elderly Cuban people, the gusanos, as you know, they're intimately called, a lot of them are moving back because they have free healthcare and they have housing, and they don't have to worry about going broke here in the United States.
Mm.
So my question is, I'm like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why are you guys moving back? I'm like, wait, what? Like, if the United States is so much better, then why aren't you staying there in your old elderly years? But lo and behold, apparently, Cuba is actually better for more marginalized people, so that's why they're actually going back. Interesting, right?
Yeah,
How?
and
Sorry, go ahead.
it's not just the case that like there's a lot of people who come not because they hate the government or socialism, but because imperialism makes it really hard, and
Mm-hmm.
there is difficult conditions, and the rationing is not easy, and standing on a line is not easy. So there are difficulties that Cubans are facing,
Mm-hmm.
and 99.9% of them understand that those are rooted in the blockade and in American imperialism, but there's still difficulties. And so
Yeah.
you have many families that, they come to the U.S. Uh, because they have a title in Cuba that allows them to, have the guarantee of getting a good job in the U.S. without having to deal with the sort of the debt that you would get if you went through an education here in the U.S. And
Mm-hmm.
if you got a university degree here, and they come here just for a materially better life, or because their family was already here. Like my family, uh, almost everyone had fled from one part of the family, and then my parents said, "Well, we're kind of alone. The family has left, so
Mm-hmm.
let's go." And it was in the '90s, when that's called the special period. The USSR had collapsed. Cuba was left alone. Caloric intake dropped by half. It was a very very difficult position for the Cuban people, not because of the government, but or socialism, but because of imperialism. So there's a lot of people that come for similar reasons, to be with their family members,
Mm-hmm.
or to live a little bit materially better because they have family members here that live better. And a lot of them are just being affirmed of the things that they knew in Cuba about the U.S. And that the first quote that I said was loneliness, right? The form of sociality that you have with people in Cuba is different from the U.S. From
Mm-hmm.
it was Tupac's birthday a couple of days ago. I know you remember that interview where he's like, in the U.S. it's all gimme, 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 gimme. I'm gonna take, just greed, and that form of very alienated sociality where
Yeah.
um, we don't relate to each other as human beings, but as commodities. That doesn't exist in Cuba. And the people who've had that their whole life, they come here and they're like, there's a form of spiritual poverty there that I don't appreciate. I might have a pool, I might be able to drink beer and have a steak, but I don't have, the spiritual enrichment that I have in Cuba when I can relate to other people in a much more humane manner.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's a factor too. It's not like all the people in Miami and in the diaspora are gusanos. There's a lot of people um, that are still in favor of socialism and came for a myriad of other reasons. But it's yeah, it's if Cuba's allowed to if the blockade is even partially lifted as it was during the Cuban thaw process with Obama, Cuba has shown itself to be able to grow in those
Oh
years, those 2 to 3 years of that thaw process, which was mediated by Pope Francis. um, Cuba had the highest GDP in the region, and it was a growth that actually meant something. Unlike the growth here, like the GDP can go up and down, and the people don't feel nothing. They're still poor and exploited. But in Cuba, the GDP goes up, and it reflects itself in what the people and the people's living standard.
yeah.
So just the partial lifting of that blockade was tremendously helpful to stimulate the Cuban economy and the living standards of its people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very tough, but I see that the younger people in South Florida are changing in
Mm-hmm.
terms of consciousness. They don't have the rabid anti-communism of their parents and grandparents. They are experiencing a futureless future here. They realize that they either can't get an education, or if they did, they're in massive debt over it. They realize that they don't have health care, or if they do have health care, is a sort of health care where, as my wife, she went to the dentist, and to get treated, she needed what was left over from the insurance was like $30, and then that was like a checkup. They told her, well, if you actually want the treatment, um, you have to pay like $700 to do these things to your teeth, whatever it was. Right? The vast majority of people are in that condition, and so they start thinking like, what the hell? What is this superiority that I've been told my whole life? What is this American exceptionalism? What the fuck are we really the best at?
Yeah.
It seems like we're only the best at invading other nations and being, uh,
Uh-huh.
the global exploiter and expropriator and oppressor. So a whole lot of younger Cuban Americans are changing their consciousness in South Florida. And in 2020, that younger demographic from 18 to 35, they voted overwhelmingly for Bernie,
Yeah.
which of course, we have a whole lot of critiques of,
Hmm.
but it shows a change in their consciousness, which I think is telling.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that and it's funny how a lot of times people will go, you know, you were talking about how a lot of people have moved here, from Cuba because of sometimes the rationing is tough for them, which I fully understand. You have a lot of people go, well, they fled Cuba. And the thing is, they went from one country that rations to another country that rations. Now, it may be a little bit easier for them, but they're still in a country that rations. Um, and, uh, you know, speaking of family, there was this one more thing that I actually wanted to talk about too. And then I'll get to some of the comments. But one of the things that I also want to talk about was the family code law that was passed in Cuba last year. This was a massive this is a massive shift in my view of Cuba, even when it comes to socially how they view people who are marginalized like myself. And so um, from what I have here, there's an article, and a lot of people are like, "Well, what are the Cuban family code laws?" Well, the Cuban family code laws were a set of laws that were ratified by the Cuban populace in order to redefine family. And so this is out of People's Dispatch. It says the people of Cuba approve a new progressive family code with an overwhelming majority in historical national referendum on September 25th. The morning of September 26th, Alina Basero, president of the National Electoral Council, reported with 94.25% of the votes counted, Cubans decided by a resounding 66.87% of the votes, ratifying the implementation of the new family code in consultation with the general public. So, it says this new family code has been described by experts as the most inclusive, progressive, and revolutionary code in the world. So, for instance, one of the things that I learned was that the definition of family is not what capitalists like to define as the nuclear family, mom, dad, children, right? Family is basically what you choose your family to be in Cuba. And it also gives, uh, it also gives, LGBTQ people the right to marry. And this is by vote, not by court order. You know what I mean? Which is different here in the United States. In the United States, we got the right to marry through the courts, which means that can be overturned at any time. Versus in Cuba, 2/3 of the population, voting population, voted for this, basically meaning that 2/3 of Cuban people think, oh yeah, if you're gay, you should be able to get married. So that on top of solidifying the relationship with grandparents as being part of the family. Also, if you are trying to look for a surrogate to have a child, then that person who's a surrogate can't charge you upteen thousands of dollars just to have a kid for them. Meaning that if you're somebody who's poor who needs a surrogate, you don't have to try to find thousands of dollars to try to have a kid. So it's some of these things that were done in these family code laws that are just revolutionary and a social aspect. And it makes me look at Cuba as more socially progressive than the United States, which is one of the reasons why I said I would be comfortable going and vacationing in Havana with me and my boyfriend more than I would vacationing here in Orlando, Florida. Crazy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And these are things that the revolution has been able to develop. Like, it wasn't like that consciousness was there right after the revolution. We have to be cognizant of the fact that the evils in terms of false consciousness, either racist false consciousness or homophobic false consciousness, which are inherited, sexist false consciousness, which are inherited from capitalism and colonialism and imperialism. They don't go away on day one after you grab power. It takes a generation and generations of educating people to overcome those prejudices to get to the place where Cuba is. So one of the big things that the Gusanos bring up is the unfair treatment of gay people at the beginning of the revolution. And for the last like 30 years of his life, Fidel was like saying, we fucked up. Those were prejudices that we inherited. We were wrong. We changed our mind. You could do that in a democratic society, right?
Hmm.
You could develop and use education as a tool of lifting social consciousness, removing prejudices. You can't do that in capitalism, really. Or if you do, it's thanks to like these broad democratic struggles. It's not thanks to the capitalist class just giving you stuff. So, yeah, you have all these different movements. The I think the vegan movement is getting even bigger in Cuba, like people pushing for like animal rights, and so they're allowed insofar as they're not calling for like the overthrow of the government and getting money from the U.S. empire. Cuba allows these democratic movements to take place and voices them, and allows a sphere of democratic debate and voting in a way that the U.S. wouldn't even think about doing. But what's interesting, just to go back, we were talking about the people that go back. Um, there was this famous song from La Charanga Banera. It was this group of Cuban artists at the beginning of the 2000s, many of which have gone on to do their own projects and have just gotten huge. One of which composes now this group called Gente de Zona, massive Cuban group, perhaps the most well known today. But there was a song when they were in La Charanga Banera, which was called um something along the lines of like, I'm here, I might not have the cool shit that you have in the US, but I'm loving my life. I'm loving the people I'm with. I'm loving the relations that I'm with. Yeah, I might be eating not the same food as you are, but I'm more human. And the image that's painted of the person that went to Cuba, that went to the US and might be a little bit richer, is one of a deep spiritual poverty. And Cuban music, reggaeton, was like that. It was about the uplifting Cuban forms of intercourse, and condemning the more materialistic, not in the philosophical sense, but the more hungry for commodities attitudes that we have in the U.S. and that people who leave Cuba for the U.S. end up adopting. Um, and these same groups, after 20 years of funding from USAID and NED, are now the ones that are leading the charge in condemning Cuba, and in coming up with slogans like Patria y Vida, homeland and life, which they try to contrast it with the homeland or death slogan of Cuba, without knowing that homeland and life was also created, developed by Fidel Castro. Um, and there's these networks of people that have a lot of institutional and financial backing behind them, and that pressure Cuban artists and Cuban athletes into aligning with them. So if a boxer doesn't condemn the Cuban government, he'll be condemned by the Miami community. He won't be able to fight in some stadiums, etc. The same thing with artists. So there's so much pressure still to have like the professionals, whether in terms of athletes or artists, to have them come to the imperialist fold. And it's worked with a big chunk of them, a big chunk of artists that were pro Cuba, critical of empire, upholding Cuban values, socialist values, and which are now just stooges of imperialism. And you have to ask, why was that? Did Cuba become totalitarian from one day to the next? Or did the billions of dollars which have been given to these groups, does that play a role in it? And so that's not noticed. And the rhetoric that you get from empire is, well, Cuba's suppressing black artists because it always has to be a minority to play on the sentimentalities of the people in the empire, which have attuned themselves to the struggles of oppressed and marginalized groups. What's left out is that those minorities, those black artists, get that money from the empire. When they come to the U.S., they meet with Trump, they meet with the fascist DeSantis, and that's what's always left out. But Um, yeah, that's one of the recent developments,
Yeah.
which is somewhat scary. But there's still a bunch of Cuban music that's pro-revolution and that the people listen to.
Yeah, that was actually something that I was actually, curious about as well, because even when I was talking, I'd be on Twitter talking about the family code laws and about how, it's safe for people like me to be in Cuba, as a queer person. Then they'll go, just ask people, somebody will go, well, just ask them about how they treat black people in Cuba. And I'm like, uh, I didn't get that impression that they treated black people badly in Cuba. They may have had their missteps, just like the United States has had its missteps for 400 years. And saying missteps is explaining extremely lightly. But as far as Cuba goes, I mean, there may have been some prejudice, but of course, when it comes to the revolution, they realize that everybody is, all one, and we're all workers. We're all part of the proletariat. And so, can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know that Fidel Castro gave a dear apology to those of us who are queer.
Hmm.
But can you speak to how the treatment or the the thought that Afro Cubans are mistreated? Can you speak to that a little bit, just to debunk
Yeah,
that?
well, I don't. I just have to echo what the leading freedom fighters from the U.S., the Black Freedom Movement, have said when they've gone to Cuba. I feel like a human being here. I feel like a human being here. I feel like racism's either abolished or they're working actively to abolish it in the minds of the most backward segments of society that have continued to inherit this old colonialist, capitalist tradition of racism. There's a good quote from one of our friends and contributor. We published one of his books, Carlos Martinez. He's got a quote where he says, "Capitalism cannot function without racism, and socialism cannot function with racism." And that is the fundamental difference. Capitalism needs ways, whether it's racism, homophobia, sexism, to divide the people and to keep them divided, because divide and conquer. And socialism cannot function if it sustains those divisions in the people. It needs the people to be united so that they can wage a collective fight against imperialism, and in the cases where it exists, against a national bourgeoisie. So um, they've made tremendous inroads in fighting against racism and fighting against sexism and in fighting against homophobia and other forms of xenophobia in general. And um, it's it's a tremendous inspiration for us in the empire that also have a horrific legacy of different forms of otherizing and dehumanizing other people. It's a model for how it is that socialism is necessary, is a fundamental part of the struggle for overcoming all of those different
Yeah.
forms of otherizations and dehumanizations of oppressed and marginalized groups.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to bring out was, a lot of people don't know this, but Asada Shakur actually took refuge in Cuba.
Yeah, yeah,
She's in Cuba right now. And if Cuba was as anti-black as some of these people say it is, she would have been right back here in the United States. But the thing is that she decided to go there because, like you said before, black people, when they go to Cuba, they feel like a human being. So here is a black radical and the black radical tradition of the Black Liberation Army that fled to Cuba. Why would you flee to someplace if you thought that you would be, if you
yeah,
thought that you would be, treated horribly? She didn't go to the UK. She didn't go to France. She didn't go to Belgium. She didn't go to Netherlands. She chose Cuba. And so that's something to think about. Not only is she black, but she's also a woman,
mm,
right? And if from what I read, Cuba did an equalizing as far as genders.
yeah.
It was years back, for men and women, so that men and women are treated equally in Cuba. So, I mean, if you are a feminist, especially a black feminist, Cuba would be one of the places that you would want to flee to.
Well, that's part of the problem that both the liberal or woke wing of empire and the conservative wing have is, you know, one side sees the emancipation of black people and other minorities in a very representationalist manner. So
Mhm.
when we get 15% of billionaires to be black, then we got black freedom, right? When we have a black Ariel in The Little Mermaid, then we have black freedom. And the problem is not like the black Ariel, as the conservatives, and the Republican anti-woke crowd wants to make it. There's no problem with a black Ariel. That's completely absurd how people consider that a problem. The problem is when that is claimed to be emancipatory, and when
Yeah.
that is itself, when you point at that and you're like, oh, that's liberation for black people or for women or for gay people, etc. Because it's not, right. It's representation is not in itself emancipation. But when you have it in the case of Cuba, where you have the general uplifting of these groups,
Yeah.
then reflect themselves in the forms that representation takes, where the vast majority of professionals and politicians and people in positions of power in Cuba are women. That's a whole different thing, right? So it's a representation that is undergirthed by a substantial uplifting of all sectors of that marginalized and oppressed group. And that's what you don't have in the U.S. In the U.S., now you have a diversification of an attempt to diversify the ruling strata, and that's not emancipation, and we should not be fooled by that, not one bit.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And there's so much more. Um, there's so much more facts, you know, about Cuba that people really need to truly grasp with. Um, and as a, like I said before the stream, you know, I would say that, you know, you are still heartfelt a citizen of Cuba as much as you're a citizen of this country, because I mean, if I were Cuban American, I would be repping Cuba and the government and how the people live their lives, and how the people represent their revolutionary struggle. I'd be repping that every single day. I probably have a Cuban flag behind me right now. But I think that listening to people like you at Midwestern Marx is great in order to get this perspective, because you are Cuban, as well as there are many other different channels that also talk about the real Cuba. One of the people who actually went to observe Cuba recently was Pasta from Combo Couch, and he talked about how free and fair their elections are in Cuba, which you know as someone, he's kind of on the left. Not I don't I think he's slightly more libertarian, but even still, for him to go there and go, man, their elections are free and fair compared to ours, right? I think that's something to keep into account.
It's a
Um,
federal holiday. Sorry to interrupt, because I was trying to type it, write it down to remind myself, and my pen ran out of ink. It's a federal holiday too. How many working people in the U.S. can't vote because they're working, and because they know in certain parts of the country that going to vote means standing in a line for hours. That's not the case in Cuba. It's a federal holiday. They try to ensure that as many people as possible votes, and you see that in the percentage that actually comes out to vote. Whereas in the U.S., regular presidential election, you get around 60% coming out. In in Cuba, it's always in the 90s. It's dipped a little bit in the last couple of years to the high 80s, but what's like high 80s compared to like 65% in the U.S.
yeah, yeah, and it's something that we really need to keep in mind. There's some channels that also talk about it, that talk about like the one I shared from Azure Scapegoat. Actually did a video on Azure Scapegoat is a socialist that talks about the actual voting process in Cuba. If you guys want to know a little bit more detail about that as well, so you have people like Carlos here that can tell you a lot about Cuba. You have Azure Scapegoat, their channel talks about it, and so and one more thing, this is kind of small, but I know a lot of times here on RBN, and I'll be getting into about the police in a little bit with my next story. But if we had, I think, let me ask you this: the relation to people in the police in Cuba, how is their relate? How do they relate to each other? Is it a positive relation, or is it kind of just like, they're police? How is it in Cuba? I just would like to know that.
Well, it's largely positive because the police are from the people.
Mm-hmm.
They see their duty as actually serving the people and not
Mm-hmm.
terrorizing poor and working class communities, specifically black and brown working class communities. Um, they're not carrying guns, so even when there are the very blue moon cases where there are acts of I honestly haven't seen any, but there was like in the July protests, one officer that had to defend himself from the mob that had hit the streets. Um, they used the baton, so there's no like they're not killing people who present a nuisance to them. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a whole different form of relationality, and that's the thing that like slogans like "abolish the police." Yeah, this police is the police that serves the capitalists, but we're
Mm-hmm.
going to need people's militias.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we have socialism to defend not just our class from the people that want to betray it in the interest of empire, um, but also to defend from empire in general. So to ensure that certain elements that have forms of consciousness that are anti-socialist, like when you're rationing food and people are coming to steal food that's has to be rationed, that has to be punished, right? And so a lot of the cases that you have of people in the U.S. talking about political prisoners, they're really people that just broke the law, and it's much more intensified when you're against a rock and a hard place and you have to ration resources. Um, so yeah, the relation to the police is completely different because it's the people's armed forces and not the armed forces of their class enemy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And last thing before you go, have you ever seen the show Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives?
Oh, it sounds familiar, but
Okay, Guy Fieri. He has this
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
spiky like blonde hair. Okay, he did an episode in Cuba, bro. I'm telling you, he was loving it because he has that really nice classic car. Well, he brought it to Cuba, and the Cubans were like, "Hey, yeah, we see you. Look at ours." It was awesome. But he actually did diners, drive-ins, and dives in Cuba, and one of the Cuban restaurant guys in the restaurant said, "Yeah, all of our food is organic. We
Oh
have
yeah.
no choice but to have nothing but organic food." And he was just enjoying the food there. So if you get a chance, just go on YouTube and look up that episode. You're gonna love it because I mean it's just amazing how the food that he was just loving the food there in Cuba. And yes, they have restaurants in Cuba. I want to go. I want to go and I want to eat because I'm fluffy and I like to eat, so I got to get over there. So,
Yeah, I've put on some sympathy weight after my wife's pregnancy as well. I'm not sure the medical status of sympathy weight, but I'm gonna
mhm.
go for it. But yeah, it's. I mean, maybe we should think about doing a collaborative brigade between RBN and the Institute. We can all go. It's so important. Not only does it help bring resources to the Cuban Revolution, which has been really a guidepost of for the world movement towards socialism when everything collapsed and it seemed like neoliberalism and imperialism was the end of history, as Fukuyama proclaimed. Cuba was still there standing as a light of hope, and so was the DPRK as well. And
Mhm.
so it's but these brigades they also help people see Cuban reality, see some of the contradictions that are at play, how where those contradictions are rooted, and it helps humanize Cuba and Cubans, which is something that the empire uh, an essential component of its narrative against any nation is dehumanization, otherizing of their people. And with these brigades, you break that. People come back, they talk to their family, to their communities, to
Yeah.
their co-workers, to
Mhm.
their fellow students. They talk about those experiences, and they're able to break that brainwashing and manipulation of capitalist ideology and dehumanization of Cuba, Venezuela, etc., etc.
But I got to say this humanizing Cubans is easy, man. So easy. They are a very deeply affectionate and loving people. So it's like, just look. Okay, I gotta say this. Okay, so I had a workmate, Gino. If you ever hear this, this is a shout out to you. He's an Afro-Cuban, and we were working we were working in a store together, and Gino was a very compassionate man, very, and I'll tell you this, as you know, he had this masculine nature about him, right? Kind of machismo, masculine, right? This is the same man that knew I was gay would come in, give me a kiss on the cheek, and say, "My brother, give me a huge hug." And yo, masculine as hell, straight dude, giving me a kiss on the cheek and calling me his brother and putting his arm around me. That I'm like, if that's Cuba, bring my ass to Havana now, because I'm just like, bro, this is he's the most chill, affectionate, loving dude. And he would be like, look, this is my daughter in Cuba, and this is my wife, and I would love for you to come by. And it's just people from these countries like DPRK, Cuba, Venezuela, Vietnam. It's humanizing them is so easy, it's effortless. So if you guys can meet people from these different countries, meet them, have them over, break bread with them, because that, do not do what the United States does, was dehumanize them. Do not go that route. Humanizing people from these countries is a revolutionary act in itself to me.
That's such a good point, because that was one of the shocks when I first got to Iowa. I grew up in Miami, born in Cuba, grew up in Miami, went to Iowa for baseball. That's how I ended up falling in love with philosophy, and the rest is history. But I had grown up in a form of social intercourse where you dap up your friends, you give them the half hug and a half kiss on the cheek. And the girls that are your friend, you give them a kiss on the cheek. So you walk in, let's say I walk into the class and there's like 15 people and half of them are good friends of mine. I do that to each one of them before I go sit down. And everyone would do that sort of thing. That's just how it was in South Florida, because most people are Cuban, and then the other people that are not Cuban end up adapting that form of relationality. Um, Getting to Iowa and like not seeing that what the people do is like, hey, what's up? Or like, hey, and not like, where's the kiss, where's the hug, where's the dap, like what happened to it? It's a much colder form of intercourse, and it's not their fault. It's not like they hate you for not hugging you, but it's that warmth, that Cuban warmth. It was missed. I do miss it, and it's when I go back, it's always something that I appreciate. And you'll be in the middle of a conversation if you find someone in the street that you'll be in the middle of a conversation, and as the conversation escalates to a cool, like to a more hype point or whatever, they'll just dap you up and give you a hug, and so you can be in one conversation and hug the same person like 4 or 5 times, and
Wow.
that proximity to other human beings, you just don't get it. And the Midwest is very nice. The people in the Midwest are super sweet, super nice, but that physical contact, you don't have it.
Oh man, I gotta get there. I'm gonna I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna get there. So I got a couple of comments that I want to go over as well. If you want to stick around, that's cool. But I'll be going over these really quick. Um, Joseph Bett says the Batista government was openly racist against Afro-Cubanos.
And the paradox is that Batista was half black.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, what they tried to do is get the very they tried to convince black Cubans that Batista was in their interest, and it wasn't like it didn't work. Perhaps for a very small amount of them, but they tried to play on the identity of Batista to get black people to support him, and the vast majority of them didn't. Um, and then they would also play on that, like, oh, Fidel's white, Batista's black, so it's not new, the sort of uh, divisive rhetoric and false rhetoric based on like projected racial antagonisms onto Cubans. It's not unique to our age. It's been around for since the start.
Gotcha. And then Kurt Boss says United Fruit, then used CIA, went into every Latin American country to ensure Cuba replay didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense though, because like for instance, I think it was in was it Guatemala or Honduras, where they actually were, it's the United Fruit Company again wanting to own the land and basically extract the resources from the country. And they end up, having coups and changing their government, putting in a puppet that they wanted. The United States putting a puppet that they wanted. And so it's like, yeah, we don't want Cuba to happen. We don't want to replicate that.
And
So
that was
they,
before Cuba. That was in '54 in Guatemala.
oh,
Um,
really?
and the year before that, there's something similar in Iran. So
With
it's
Mohammed Mossadegh, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's almost like these stupid rom-coms that, we like them, but they just end up repeating the same thing and just changing the characters. They change the variable, but the formula ends up being the same, and that's what imperialism does. So like a lot of these stories of different countries in Latin America, they're the same story, just with
Mhm.
different actors.
Yeah.
It's the different actors on the part of the people that are imperialized. On the part of the imperialists is usually the same actors and the same methods. But um, yeah,
Yeah. And this is also from Kurt saying, isn't the state bailing out banks communism? No, it's not. The state bailing out banks is capitalism because you have the big businesses and the oligarchs using the state for its own ends to bail it out so that
I
they
thought
can stay.
Obama was a communist.
Huh?
I thought Obama was a communist, and now Biden. Biden.
Yeah.
They swept
Barack
it under the
Hussein
rug.
Obama, the commie.
You see how they swept it under the rug? Why do you think that is? It's because if people hear the truth, like we just bailed out another fucking bank as we
Yeah.
did in 2008, while people are struggling to get by, and we just bailed out another bank, um, they'll come out into the streets again because
Hmm.
the consciousness is a lot higher. They still remember 2008. They remember how the government preferred to save big business than to save working class people.
Yep. Definitely. Thanks for the love, Sybil Proxy. Um, Here's something that cracks me up. Um, I don't, Max. I don't know where you're getting your information from, but Max says only under a capitalist society can you complain about a beneficial societal monetary design while a government malfeasance from an iPhone while sipping a Starbucks coffee with zero repercussions. Number one, I don't have Starbucks, baby. I have water. First of all, okay.
Don't
So
show them the logo. Is that smart water?
yeah,
That's bougie
actually
water.
no. See, here's the thing. My mother bought me a bottle of Smart Water a few months ago, and I've been reusing the same bottle and refilling it with water ever since.
God.
So, yes. So, suck on that. Okay. First of all. Secondly, okay. By the way, as we just specified before, places like DPRK, Vietnam, China, and Cuba have very vibrant democracies, more vibrant here than the United States. All right. I suggest you do research on that, first of all. Second of all the items that are built within an iPhone. Now, by the way, I got Android because iPhone sucks. Apple sucks ass anyway. But Apple and Android, all the pieces within it were done through research and development through public colleges and universities, baby. So the cameras, the screen, the touch screens, all these different pieces that culminate together to make these devices were done in public colleges and universities. So therefore, it was all publicly funded, right? Who were the first people in space? Wasn't it the Soviets? Wasn't it under a socialist government that they were able actually to get out into outer space? The
And they
first
made
man
the phone.
under a socialist government?
They made the phone. The Soviets invented the phone.
Good night, everybody. I'm gone. What? Yo. So if you guys really want to talk about, technological advancements, hell, we were talking about medical advancements just under, Cuban government. So technological advancements is not nothing new. And also, why are we talking about, technological advancements in many other socialist countries that are coming out? they are advancing society, because guess what? They're not beholden to things only being done out of a profit motive, right? And in fact, let me get this comment down. One of the things that I just found, and this isn't even the technological advancement thing. Let me share this with you really quick, because I'm going to talk about this on my show, because I think it is really interesting. Um, Perfect. So let me share my screen really quick, because everybody wants to talk about, oh well, you need the profit motive in order to make things better. Well, look at here. This is at a more perfect union. They say, do you ever feel like there's no original movies anymore? No new ideas. It's not just in your head. Over half the movies coming out of Hollywood are now prequels, sequels, reboots, or remakes. The reason? Corporate greed. So come to find out that you can't even get a good movie in capitalism anymore.
Yeah. Well, what's I hate to cite these people because they were part of the anti-communist so-called Marxists that we rail on a good portion of our time. But the one work that Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer did do that
Mm-hmm.
I still think has some relevance is the one chapter on the culture industry in Dialectics of Enlightenment, where they
Mm-hmm.
say like what has commodification done to culture? It just ends up replicating whatever statistically you can ensure will sell. And it's just the same body but different embellishments, and it's just continuously pumping it out, and it's pumping people with things that are substantially the same but accidentally different. And so different characters, different, but the story, everything is the same. And that stifles cultural innovation, right? So capitalism not only the Marxist formula, not only do the relations of productions, the way we produce, prevent us from developing the forces of production, because we only produce for what is profitable, and that stifles human production. It also stifles culture. It stifles everything that's related to a human form of life. Um, so it's an incredibly backwards and conservative and stifling force for humanity.
Yeah, definitely. And this is, I love having these conversations. I actually want to have more look, hell, even if we have these conversations in private, I want to talk about this more, because this is great, because this encourages me to learn more about these nations that have came together for the people in order for them to have more freedom, right? Uh, and look, this is why I been wanting to have you on. Sorry for pestering you so much,
No,
having you,
no, no, not at all.
but
Not at
yeah,
all, brother.
yeah.
Well,
So I
thank you.
really love this. Now I'll be getting into the next story. If you would like to stick around for the next story, you
Oh, my
can.
wife will shoot me. She'll
Oh,
take me back and do what the Gusanos think the Cubans did, but they didn't do. But she's a real Stalinist, and it's Father's Day, so I got to go spend some time with her and the baby. But thank you so much for having me on, brother. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again, and I'm very happy to see what you guys at RBN are doing, and um, it's just wonderful stuff and right what we need at this moment. So thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to seeing you Tuesday, right? So,
Yeah, I'll be on. Yeah, on for the class. Yes,
yeah.
Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yep,
All right.
I'll be there.
Well,
Yeah,
take care. Thank you for having me on. See you.
thank you so much. All right, bye bye. All right, everybody, and make sure to also go to Midwestern Marx. They actually have their own website, midwesternmarx.com, so you guys can get their resources. Carlos also came out with a new book as well. That he focuses on the purity fetish, and how we need to come together as workers in order to truly change the system. So if you guys have not, also go to midwesternmarks.com, as well as I also put the links in the description as well below, so you guys can also look into that too. I ran further over than what I wanted to, but the conversation was just that good. But I'm going to get to this final story as well, because this is also very important that we need to get to. But I Before I do that, let me go to some of the comments in the chats. Let me see. Let's let's go here and share the screen because I'm going to the rock first. Solid like a rock. All right. So thanks to Laura for the tip on Rockman. Thank you so very much. Gene Whitworth says, last time I talked to an orthopedic surgeon about half a decade ago, he was fresh out of med school. And instead of ordering an MRI, what I needed, he started talking about huge bone clamps and bone saws, then sent me to a physical therapist. That's what helped me in my decision to save money, turn Medicare down. They kicked me off OHP when I turned 65 and spend the money on healthy eating and lifestyle instead. So far, that's way better. Thank you so very much for that. Gene continues to accept. I still haven't gotten the joint surgeries. Gotten way less from this medical system than I paid in. That's not even calculating long-term returns on the money like the capitalists afford themselves. Hemkar, thank you so much, says doctors to 60 nations around the globe, over a quarter of the planet. Gene continues, says, I remember back in the late 80s and early 90s, Cuba was making breakthroughs in AIDS. They've always understood and employed the stitch in the time saves 9 cliche. Hemkar, thank you, says, have a lung cancer treatment too. Yes, Carlos was talking about that. Hemkar says, created a non-MRA COVID shot and ventilators because of the embargo. Yeah, I think they had over a 90% vaccination rate in Cuba, which is amazing. And, so that's amazing. Gene says, humanity got the 19th century without jabs. Pretty sure sticking strictly to what the nature provides, not contaminating and polluting, would be best. Thank you for that. Hemkar says, I don't trust doctors here. I've been trying to go to Cuba to see one. Don't want to travel by myself. Looking for an escape artist to help pay for it. Oh, Hemkar says, LOL, my water bottle right now. My last was a Gatorade one. Was given a clean canteen, but the asket was missing somehow. Okay. Thank you so very much, guys. Oh, man. Yeah, I'm trying to get to Cuba myself. I would like to go there and visit. And let's go to thank you so much, Cobra Commander. Says Carlos is the brains of Midwestern Marx and Jaybe is the heart of RBN. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure Carlos will also appreciate that as well. Gamer for Life says capitalism needs to be abolished. You ain't saying nothing but a word, brother. Or sister or sibling. I forget who Gamer for Life. I don't want to assume your gender, by the way. But thank you so much. Hasta la victoria siempre. I don't know what that means. I gotta see. That's the thing. I need to learn Spanish just so I can go to Cuba and communicate with the people because I need to do that. You see, Marco says capitalism is going to die one way or another. Absolutely, that is true. Whoever says cookies, it was a horrible. But let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. You guys are having a conversation in here. Let me see. Let me see. Who? Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Okay. Raphael says, old memory, Disney brought Congress to extend copyright, etc., for many more years. At the time, actual journalism had stories of old cartoonists who created content Disney would continue to make. Oh, yeah. I know that. Oh, millions. We're living in poverty. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Roger Meadows. 2 days, baby, 2 days. Yeah, I'll be having an interesting conversation on Tuesday. So you guys who are in the chat right now, if you guys have not subscribed to my channel, you guys would like to, you guys can go there, and I'll be having two interesting conversations on my channel. One, oh, by the way, like the stream. But yeah, so I'll be having on Akile Naive from the African People's Socialist Party. We'll be talking about the indictments against the African People's Socialist Party, some of the members, and we'll be an update basically from her last visit. And then I will also be talking to Nelson Betancourt, who is looking at trying to establish a public bank in Orange County, Florida, where I live. And I'll be having a conversation with him, and I'll be excited for that. So, guys, be sure to tune in to my channel as well, because we'll be talking about that at length. So I'm really excited about it. In fact, let me put the link in the chat. Let me see. Actually, you know what? I'll just put this link in, and then we can get to the next story. So you guys all have it. And also, if you guys are on Rockman, I have my channel on Rockman too. But yeah, so I can't wait for that. But thanks for the super chat, Roger. Appreciate it. All right. Now, the next story is going to be a tough one to go through. Oh, wait, hang on. Marco says Cuba is actively organizing worker cooperative. Ooh, nice. You know how something's so good, you got to give it a stank face? Nice. All right. I see you, Cuba. All right. So the next story we're going to be talking about. So we just had on Carlos Garrido. Thank you so very much for being on. The next one was for justice for Mykaella Sharlman. This is a tough story. So if you guys are not prepared for this, then please, if you guys need to exit, I fully understand. Before you go, make sure to give a like for the stream before you go. If you guys would like to subscribe to our Substack at revolutionaryblackout.substack.com, so that you guys can be email notifications. Also, if you guys would like to, you guys can also donate for our graphics designer, Erin. She does an amazing job with clips as well as graphics for us. Thank you so very much to Erin. You guys can go to Venmo at Revolutionary Blackout and Cash App $Mutual Aid Forever. Thank you so much, Erin, for the work that you do, because I wouldn't be able to do it. I couldn't do it on my own. So thank you. So now, this is the story. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to defer to this article for Mykaella Sharlman. Mykaella Sharlman was a young Black woman that was murdered. Murdered or overdose. It begs the question. Part of me wants to lean towards murder, but this is a sad story. So oh my goodness. It says case dismissed against men accused of burning Antioch woman's body. DA cites police racist text scandal. Let's get into it. It says 2 men accused of burning a woman's body in Antioch last year will not stand trial after the Contra Costa County District attorneys determined the case was tainted too much by officers involved in the Antioch Police Department's racist texting scandal. Ashton Montevallo, 32, and D'Angelo Leray Boone, 39, had both been facing arson and mutilation charges in connection with the death of 25-year-old Mykaella Sharlman. Sharlman's body was found badly burned on October 17th on the Mokelumne Trail near Gentrytown Drive. Antioch police released photos of the jewelry she was wearing to help identify her. This is Mykaella Sharlman. Says, after thoroughly reviewing the officer's role in the case, applying relevant legal principles, the considering ethical responsibilities, the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office no longer has confidence in the integrity of this prosecution. Our office extends our deepest sympathies for the family of Mykaella Sharlman, and we aspire to renew this prosecution if presented with the opportunity to do so. So because the officers are, part of this, the officers that would be investigating this against the officers that were charged, they can't in good faith actually go against and investigate this, because the officers that would be doing the investigation are also implicated in a anti-Black racist texting scandal. So they can't even investigate the officers involved in this. So the charges were dropped. She was put in a dumpster and set on fire after she died. When I say defund the police towards abolition, this is the type of stuff I'm talking about. Now, let me go here, because I'm going to defer to friend to RBN Nico House, because he actually talks about it as well. And this was tough. Let's go. Thanks for the clip, Nico.
Two Antioch police officers who were being investigated for dumping Mykaella Sharlman's body into a dumpster and then lighting it on fire have had the charges against them dropped. Now, you might have noticed I said they had their charges dropped. Not that they weren't found guilty, because they literally never went to court to figure out if they were guilty of anything in order for them to plead not guilty. Now, before Mykaella was put in a dumpster that was eventually lit on fire, she supposedly died of a fentanyl overdose. Now, these cops did find her, but they just didn't call it in. Now, for some, that may not sound too suspect until you start learning about the context of the antics of the Antioch Police Department, such as the fact this is the same police department that actually had racial texts exposed, some of which show that they were purposely stopping drivers because they were Black. Or one cop who said that they would buy somebody a prime rib dinner if they took out the mayor, who, of course, is also Black. They even have a civil rights lawsuit against them, alleging that they have exemplified a vile mistreatment of citizens in the area. Given all this information, of course, the family, like myself, is a little bit skeptical. And I think that, once again, given all the information, they're perfectly justified in that skepticism.
So that just, it makes me, it makes me weary. That is, we continue to see things like this happen. People will still say, oh, but there's good police out there. Are there? The institution needs to go. Until we can actually change this system and have proper public safety apparatus, this system is unsustainable. There are some other details that I want to bring out as well. This is out. This is another one. It says family woman found in dumpster is ready to fight after charges drop because police department's racist text. Now it continues. It says Nicole Eason told NBC News that the messages, which were released earlier this year after a joint investigation into the Antioch Police Department by the FBI and the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office, should have no effect on the prosecution of Ashton Montalvo and D'Angelo Boone. It says Montalvo and Boone were charged with arson and mutilation of human remains on October 17th. Death of Mykaella Sharlman. Both pleaded not guilty to the charges. But one of the things I want to bring out was this. Says homophobic slurs and racist images. The messages from 2020 to 2021 were sent and received by dozens of officers, including homophobic slurs, racist images, and casual discussion of using less lethal weapons on people, including the city's mayor, who is black, according to an investigative report compiled by the Contra Costa's District Attorney's Office. California Attorney General opened an investigation last month to determine if the police department engaged in a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing. It says, as Garrido said, Wednesday's announcement marked the first time the prosecutor's office has dropped a felony case linked to the messages. Overdose and Death, says Eason described her younger sister as the life of the party, someone who loved praise and dancing at church and dreamed of opening a salon. She fell in with friends who were into drugs and began experimenting. Says the medical examiner determined that Sharlman died of fentanyl overdose, said Eason, noting that her family had attended all of the court dates in her sister's death, including the preliminary hearing, where a judge determines if prosecutors have sufficient evidence to make the defendant stand trial. Eason said that during the court testimony, Montalvo and Boone were accused of dumping her sister's body in a dumpster they grabbed from a nearby building after she overdosed at an abandoned apartment in Antioch, a city of roughly 114,000 northeast of San Francisco. The men were captured on security cameras borrowing a dolly from a 7-Eleven and pushing the dumpster 4 blocks to a paved trail where witnesses from a nearby homeless encampment saw them allegedly pour lighter fluid into the dumpster and set Sharlman's body on fire. Roughly a week later, after Sharlman's family reported the 25-year-old as missing, Eason said authorities confirmed her death. Eason compared the events to labor pains. She said, I didn't have the joy of getting the baby out. She said, we got death instead. As the family found some solace learning of Sharlman's case, cause of death, says she died before her body was torched. So that is some of the details surrounding her. So my question is, number one, who did she get the drugs from? In the resulting of her overdosing. And how did the police find her? And another question is, what did they do right after they found her? I'm going to be honest with y'all. I have a feeling that those 2 police officers did something really disgusting before they burned her body. Defund and abolish the police, baby. I don't want to attribute anything to them allegedly, but I think allegedly they did something before they burned her body. Allegedly. I gotta say allegedly to cover my ass. If that was my sister, let's go to the video that I have. Because okay. That's all I'm just saying. I ain't gonna say much else. This is why a revolution is necessary.
Antioch is just devastated after learning that prosecutors are dropping the case against 2 suspects because the main witnesses, are Antioch police officers involved in that racist texting scandal. KP's Jana Katsuyama spoke with the mother and sister of the victim in this case. Jana.
Heather, this has been such a difficult and emotional journey for them. They say they'd been in court for every hearing and were stunned to hear that this case was being dismissed.
Mykaella Sharlman's family says the wounds have been ripped open again.
I was destroyed. Sad, beyond control.
It's been 8 months since 25-year-old Mykaella's body was found burned along a trail near Gentrytown Drive.
We'll never see her get married, never see her have a baby, none of those things, because 2 men took her life right down there.
Now, they say they're grieving a second time. Contra Costa County's district attorney's office announced Wednesday that prosecutors are dismissing the case against the 2 suspects. The reason? Prosecutors say the case against the suspects, Ashton Montalvo and D'Angelo Boone, relied heavily on investigative work by Antioch police officers who are part of the racist text message scandal.
You can't even depend on investigators investigating their own because they came out as racists in a texting scandal. If you can't even depend on them to hold themselves accountable, then why even have them? You can't even bring the people who did what they did to justice. You can't even do that. You can't even hold the officers who burned her body accountable because the investigation had to be done by people who hate people like me. And so what in the world, like, how something goes wrong, who do I call? Somebody does something against me, who do I call? And people are like, well, we should get the FBI on this. Look, what did they do to MLK? What did they do to Fred Hampton? Who do you call when you're black? Who do you call when something wrong happens? And then, on top of it, when something bad does happen and nothing happens, you try to get some justice served to the people who perpetuated it, but then the people who perpetuated it can't even get charged because the people who are supposed to investigate them are also racist, also homophobic. So what are we to do? And I'm going to tell you this. This is all to the white people out there who are watching. If they're doing it to us, they're going to do it to you, and they probably have already. They're doing it to us, they're doing it to you. It's just easier to do it against us, people like me, because there is this dehumanization that is more allowed within this country. So anybody that's queer, LGBTQ, something bad happens to them, somebody who's black, because people will make excuses. Well, if they weren't the way they were, then maybe they would have been more safe, which is complete and utter bullshit. So this is why I'm for defunding the police and abolishing the police that we have in this country. You see, if we had police like they do in Cuba, probably DPRK, places like that, I wouldn't have an issue with them because they wouldn't be doing the shit that police in this country do. Right? Because they're actually more devoted to public safety. But we have a gang of thugs that wear badges and have guns that do what they want to do with us with impunity. The right thing to do was, if you found her, check her vital signs, and if she still has vital signs and she's not dead, they have access. Police also do have access to Narcan to help reverse the effects of certain drugs. Or they could just do that and then call, first responders, call the ambulance, paramedics, in order to take her to the hospital. Like I said, if you burn her body, you're burning evidence. If you burn her body, you're burning evidence. What happened after the overdose? Or what transpired before the overdose? These are valid questions, are they not? What did y'all do to get in your mind the logic of, let's just burn her body? Y'all don't see that one come off as suspicious? Your mind's going the same way, right? Right? $250,000 tested rape kits in this country that haven't even been submitted or looked into. How many of them rape kits got the DNA of a law enforcement officer in it? Just asking a question. Just asking. Abolish the fucking police. Let's go.
Message scandal.
They are material witnesses to the case. And no prosecution can proceed if the material witnesses to the case cannot testify.
Assistant District Attorney Annie Esposito reviewed the evidence, and she says the scandal that revealed racist text messages between more than 40 officers is having a huge impact, forcing prosecutors to review every single case the officers touched.
They have to.
By the way, there's 99 police officers at that precinct. 99. 45 were on that texting scandal. 45. Let's continue.
To be reviewed individually, case by case by case. We cannot make, because one size does not fit all. And because of that, it's a lot of work.
It punched me in the gut to know that my sister will never get justice because of something that's going on in our city. It just doesn't make sense.
Mykaella's family says in this case, they want Antioch police and prosecutors to refile criminal charges based on surveillance video and other evidence, something that the DA's office says they will do if new evidence emerges.
We want to investigate every avenue there is, explore every avenue there is.
There's too much evidence.
That's right.
Too much for them
Video
to let this go.
surveillance.
And again, the DA's office says that they are open to refiling charges, but this could be just one of many cases that are at risk of being tainted by this Antioch police racist texting scandal.
So I just really just don't, like, I know what needs to be done, but this is why conversations like this are important, to show people whatever you think about about some anecdotal relationship you have with a police officer. This institution is toxic, and it was built toxic. It was formed toxic. There's really no changing it. There's no reforming this. You can try to reform it as much as you possibly want. It's still going to have the same. Foundation. So, that's what is important. So, yeah, and who, like, for instance, the Antioch Police Department, all those cases that somebody was convicted, somebody was arrested. What about all the people who are in jail or in prison based on their recounting of events, on their testimony? Can you imagine how many people who are innocent are serving jail or prison time right now based off of a racist's testimony? You got to think about this, man. So, yeah, this is, one of the saddest stories, but it needs to be amplified because a lot of people, are, because a lot of people, they don't see these things. Or if they here's the thing. A lot of people hear this, we're not surprised. That's the part that's horrible. Honestly, stories like this aren't even for us black people. Stories are actually for people who are non-black, especially white people, so that you guys have the outrage that we have. So that once you guys start hearing this outrage, you guys start to realize, oh, this system is unsustainable. So then you guys see us as fellow workers, and you guys come together with us and go, you know what? This system is unsustainable. We need to change the system fundamentally. And then we can actually have a revolution. That's honestly what I'm hoping for. That's why some of these stories I put out the way I put out. Because I'm tired. I know. You guys are tired. I'm tired. Are we going to finally come together as workers and truly in this system? You've got to be tired, man. So, yeah. Justice for Mykaella. And by the way, the links are in the description. Share these widely. Share, because so many people deserve justice. So yeah. And so one of the things if you guys have not, then I recommend you all to look at 10forjustice.com, and it talks about defunding the police on the road to abolition for a better sense of public safety. So yeah. So there you go. As well as, let me put this in the chat as well. All right, so that is, one of the stories that I wanted to get to. Let me get to the comments in the chat really quick. Ooh, let me pop this out. All right. Oh, jeez. All right, so where was I last? Oh. All right, so thanks to Eric Montague, says Cuba, que linda es Cuba. Thank you so much. Roger, thank you so much for the tip on Rockfin. Roger Redo says, special prosecutor legislation to strengthen and codify Executive Order 147 passed. This legislation authorizes the Attorney General's office with jurisdiction in all cases of police killings and deaths in police custody, strengthening and memorializing Executive Order 147. The bill, if enacted, would help ensure fair and thorough investigations and, when warranted, effective prosecutions in tragic incidents that the criminal justice system has historically failed to address. End police secrecy. Repeal 50A, A25, A2513, O'Donnell, S3695, Bailey. Past New York is arguably the worst in the nation in terms of hiding police misconduct and discipline due to application of expansion of a 50A in recent years. 50A is a New York State statute that carves out unnecessary and harmful secrecy for police, fire, and corrections. 50A is routinely used as a shield police misconduct and failed police disciplinary process from public view. A repeal of 50A would provide much needed transparency on police misconduct and discipline in New York State, and help address the systemic lack of accountability for officers who engage in misconduct. Other existing FOIL statutes will constitute to protect private information about officers. Officers, like their home address, once 50A is repealed. Californians should use citizen ballot initiatives to ratify this into their constitution. Thank you so much for that, Roger. Oh, Gene, you ain't saying nothing but word. Gene says white people need to give up their white privilege if they want to come together. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So thank you so very much for that, Roger. Take that down. All right. And let's go to the regular chat. Baba Yaga Forest Dweller says, starting a community garden right next to my sidewalk, teaching my neighbors how to grow a garden. Get out there and do something. The hardest step is breaking the ice. It works. That's very true. Is one of these moments where I actually have nothing to add. You said it all. Thank you. Everybody take a note from Baba Yaga Forest Dweller. Thank you so very much. Has Been Hotel says the whole notion of defending your neighborhood became very real. I was in college. Yeah, man. Also, I forgot. I also have an announcement, guys. So be sure to stay till the end. Reparations for Imperialism says anything you do in America other than organized self-defense forces is in one way or the other supporting U.S. culture and buying the weapons pointed at revolutionary movements. Thank you so very much. Super Ultra Brandon says, how does RBN feel about Cornel West candidacy? I mean, you can look at other RBN members' opinions about it. You can go to Sabby Saps on her channel. I already talked about it on my channel. I know Nick and CJ, talked about it, over the last couple weeks. So if you really want to get, our views on it, and I'll just repeat what I said on my channel. As far as, his candidacy, of course, there's some things that I think he may have some blind spots on. But as far as the candidacy itself, I think it's an opportunity for us to use the policies that he has in place as a national conversation to shift the mindset of everybody to a more revolutionary minded mindset. Do I think he's going to win? I don't think so. But at the same time, this national conversation needs to happen so that we use it as a tool in order to raise more class consciousness. I think that's the best way to do it. But while raising the class consciousness, we also need to help people with their material conditions so that they can see that there's an alternative to this system. So this is one of the reasons why that, the chapters are so important. CJ was out in Skid Row yesterday feeding people out in Skid Row in his chapter. Sabi is already collecting information for her chapter in Boston so that she can start doing things on the ground in Boston. And I'll be doing some things, what I'll be talking about a little bit later in the stream, about starting the Orlando chapter. And then Nick is doing things for his chapter as well, while Rome is almost damn near finished with the library. So, it's using the message as a means to say, okay, so he wants to abolish NATO. All right, let's go even further and let's take the military-industrial complex and make it obsolete. Let's get rid of it, right? Or he's talking about Medicare for all. I'm saying, okay, let's go further. Let's go and get rid of the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Let's get rid of these, medical device manufacturers that make hand over fist. Let's nationalize our healthcare system so that we can actually have something better. And I know some people are going to come into the comments and go, nationalizing the healthcare system, you really want the government to be over the healthcare system? And a government that is not dictated by capital and a government that's not dictated by corporate oligarchs? Yes. But we have to get the money and the capital out of politics. So yes, that's also going to involve getting rid of the financial influence that is within our government. And once we also do that, then yes, we can have a truly nationalized healthcare system. Hell, even having a nationalized healthcare system with the government that we have now is way better than having one, than having the one that we have now. Look, they're doing a lot better than we are in the UK with their national health system. And they're still under the capitalist government. So even still under a capitalist government, we should have a national healthcare system. But imagine how much better it would be if we didn't have a government that was dictated and that wasn't under the influence of money and politics. So that's something that we really need to talk about. So there are many different ways that you can use his policy platform in order to increase a larger conversation, right? And the fact that he's working outside of duopoly is another thing, right? So that he won't get cheated by the Democratic Party. So as far as, how I feel about it, I feel it's just my opportunity to spread the idea that we need to change the system. Whether, he has a possibility of winning or not, it's the popularity that means the most for the messaging. So, yeah. So, thank you very much, Super Ultra Brandon. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's important that we shift that Overton window, because the thing is that the Red Scare, we need to have, instead of having the Red Scare, we need to do the Red Promise, right? And not red as in GOP or Republican red. No, I'm talking about socialist red, the Red Promise, the Red Hope, as it were. So yeah, Salgado says they ran out of emergency housing to hide people in, so people squat in the woods. Ugh, gosh, it's horrible. Terry Connolly giving She's Black some love. Good to see you. And by the way, what I'm going to say is still give money to mutual aid. Give money to mutual aid. There will be some people who have, the funds, to give to people like Dr. West, for his campaign, and they're going to exist. If they want to, then fine. But for the majority of us, let's let our hard-working dollars still go to mutual aid, to help people on the ground, to build up organizations outside of this system. Because ultimately, we save us. We save us. Right? So, thank you so much. Hey, She's Black. She's Black says, I'm not voting at all. I'm done with electoral politics. What I do love is the organizing, political education, and mutual aid that RBN is doing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to see you, She's Black. Oh, hey, Miguel. Says the world is waking up to the dangers of neoliberalism. Absolutely. Oh, my goodness. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to, before I do that, did you like the stream? Go ahead, give me the like. And also, if you guys have not, please make sure to subscribe to our Patreon if you would like to support us. You guys can go to Revolutionary Blackout on Patreon, as well as if you guys would like to get email notifications, you guys can go to revolutionaryblackout.substack.com for email notifications so that you guys can get that. Also, thank you so much to Aaron, our graphics designer. If you guys would like to help out with that, you guys can go to Venmo at Revolutionary Blackout or Cash App $ Mutual Aid Forever. Aaron, our graphics designer, does an amazing job. So thank you so very much to Aaron. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and this is going to be my announcement. Let me make sure I get this graphic here because I need to. I forgot to put this up. Why did I forget to put it up? Okay. All right. And oh, I can't believe I took that down. Oh wait, I think I have it. Hang on. Jaybe is all over the place, baby. Not good. Not good. Not good. Let me see. All right, let me see. Let me see. I have it. Hold on. I'll do it this way. Okay. Let me see. Got it. Boom. Let me see. All right. Oh. Link. Shorten URL. Copy. All right. Perfect. All right. So now, as you guys know, I will be doing an RBN chapter here in Orlando. So I will be accepting, contact information. So the Orlando chapter of RBN will be kicking off soon. So what am I doing is, if you guys would like to, I will be putting in the chat a link to a Google Doc so you guys can fill out. And then once it's filled out, I will get the email information from you. And then once I get the email information from you, then we can, if you're in the Central Florida or Orlando area, then what I will do is we will contact you via email about getting together. And once we get together, then we will establish, the things that we need to, the different programs that we want to do for our community. This will be done, in a democratic process. And so going over just some of the things that we'll be going over in, for this chapter. Of course, it's not going to be very intrusive. It's, just your first and last name, your email address, right? This is going to be an in-person meet and greet, but if you cannot physically attend, then I will, I'll set up a Zoom, so that, because there's some people who may want to be a part of this that may be disabled, that, can't physically attend. So if you are disabled and you can't physically attend, or if something's going on in your life where you can't physically attend, then we'll set up a Zoom so that you guys can be part of the meeting via Zoom. I would rather, if you can physically attend, then please attend. But if that's not possible, then you guys can. I would like for anybody who wants to be a part of this to be a Central Florida resident. However, if you are visiting Central Florida, let's say you're on vacation, but you want to help out a little bit, you guys can also do that as well. Let's say you're visiting from Nevada, right? And there's no chapter there. And you guys are coming here for vacation, but you want to take one day off your vacation to, assist us with something that we may be having going on here just for a few hours, then you can come here and help us out. You can help out our community for a few hours here as well. So that's why I have that in there as well. One of the questions I have is, this meet and greet will focus on community needs and ways that we can teach as well as provide resources. What type of volunteer work would you like to do? And you have different ones that you can check off. You can check off all of them if you want to. You have education and teaching. So you have classes on Marxism, classes on cooking, classes on gardening, classes on hypothetical. You can do classes on things like financial education, or classes on how to navigate Section 8, classes on how to navigate the disability, process, applying for disability, navigation, or on how to itemized for, medical bills, things like that. There's also another, part for physical work. So physical work meaning food distribution, water distribution, clothing distribution, toiletry distribution, cleaning, repairing, things like that. And then there's another one where it comes to fundraising for food, fundraising for gardening, fundraising for office, toiletries, tools, bail funds, things like that. So if you're interested in any one of these things or all of these things, you can also come together, with us on, doing these things for the community. And then if you do select other, you can also let us know what type of skills that you would like to provide for the community as well. And then we can see about, incorporating that into the structure for the chapter as well. And then also, whether or not you like to answer this question, do you have personal transportation? Because some of us do not have personal transportation. It is hard to get to these different functions where we're doing things for the community. One of the things I said was if we can try to do some functions closer to certain others within, the chapter, so that it's not as arduous of an ordeal to travel to these things, so that they can also be a part of it. But as well as maybe some of us, once we get to know each other a little bit better, can provide some of that transportation for others so that they can also participate in doing for their community as well. Because I know some people are going to have a hard time. But this is some of the things that I think are important. I shared this on my socials. Was it Thursday or Friday? I think Thursday. And so I've been wanting to share this here on RBN as well for the Orlando chapters. So if you guys would like to, you guys can go ahead and fill this out. I will share this as well again, so you guys can have the link for this as well, because I think, we talk about the problems all the time, but we also need to talk about the solutions. The solutions are what going to help us out in changing the system. This also allows us to come together as a community and say, hey, you know what? We all are suffering under this system. Hi, my name is, who are you? You live in this area. Okay, what are you dealing with? How can we be of service to you as neighbors? And then you come together as a community, so then you can go, look, this system is unsustainable for us. We need to change it. And this is how we do it on a fundamental level from the ground up. And so I'm excited. And by the way, just to let you guys know, if you are going to fill this out, please make sure to have it filled out by the 30th. You have until the 30th. So a little less than 2 weeks. So go ahead, mull it over in your mind if there's something which you want to do, if you're in Central Florida, if you're in Orlando, and if you aren't, but you have people who want to do things like this in Orlando, share it, and let them know, like, hey, you have until the 30th, so then we can actually get together. And then once I have all the information and everybody that wants to come in, then we will choose a place to meet at. It'll be, like a Panera Bread or something, or a coffee shop or something like that. And then we'll come together, we'll do a meet and greet. And then once we do that meet and greet, then we'll decide on some of the things that we would like to do. Definitely it's going to be, some of the surefire things is going to be food, clothing, toiletry, water distribution. We're doing things like that. We're going to be doing classes. I will be doing something at least once a month. Because of my physical limitations, I can't do as much as I would like to. I almost did not do an Orlando chapter because of my physical limitations. But I said, you know what? Even if I can just do a little bit compared to my physical limitations, at least I'm doing something, right? At least you do something. Many hands make the load light. That's what's important. And so the more the merrier, so that we can actually change things, so that we can put in people's minds, wait, there is a different way. A different way is possible. I am not going to sit here and depend on the electoral system to change things. We've been waiting on an electoral system to change things for 40 years. Let's do it ourselves. We save us. If you're in Orlando or Orange County, please make sure to fill that out. Get in touch with me, and let's truly change the system. Let's make things better for everybody. Because I'm sick and tired of seeing my brothers, sisters, and siblings sick and tired. So, once again, RBN Orlando chapter coming to Orlando soon. Now, I think was there another chat? Let's see. Oh, yep. Let's get to that before we go. I saw that, Roger. I ain't leaving you hanging, bruh. All right, so let's put that down. Put that up. Up, down, in, out, over, under. Okay. All right. Okay, so we read that. Dave Burt says, thanks to RBN. Thank you so much. Gene says, a very small percentage of revenues of the sick care system goes to prevention, healthcare, far too much for capitalism. Yeah, Dave Burt, absolutely. Rome does do great work. Let me see. Hempcar says, if there were more purges, maybe Klaus Schwab wouldn't be around. Yeah, Klaus Schwab can go ashway. If I have anything to say about it, just go. Roger Meadows, thank you so much for the tip. Roger says, in regards to doing things on the ground locally, perhaps one of those things will be the push if he is not already there, but I think he is there. Nelson pushing on local ballot measure for an Orange County public bank to support the local stuff, like supporting seed money for worker co-op. Ooh, I see you, Roger. Roger says, I had to sneak that in, bro. Yeah, I know. I see you, Roger. I see you. Gonna slide it on in. But yeah, that's actually a really good point. And we can actually talk about that too, when it comes to things like, citizen ballot initiatives and worker co-ops, as far as, learning things, within the chapter. I think that would be really great. Like somebody said earlier, they're trying to focus more on worker co-ops in Cuba. I mean, hey, why not? Why not, brother? All right. And let's do one more read through the chat. Let me see. Hang on. Yeah, Marco. Jaybe, from each according to their ability and each according to their need. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, Marco. All right. Terry Connolly says, don't understand why more people don't show up for Jaybe on RBN Sunday. I'm not for everybody. And that's okay. Right? It's okay. So, I don't get as many views, and that's all right. But you know what? What I do have to say is the people who are here, they're here every Sunday, and I appreciate every single person, and so I just, my personality may be different for other people, and they're like, you know what, I don't know, he's maybe a little too. Somebody said one day I was too dramatic. Uh, you know, you have people who look at me and go, like I express my solidarity with my queer folk, LGBTQ. You know what I'm saying? And some people aren't down with that for some reason, even though they watch RBN, and it's weird. But that's who I am. And for instance, I also try to give uh, some attention to people like me who are also disabled. You know, that's also very important. I think that we really need to focus. I need to focus on that because that's one of the hats that I wear. And so some people, they just don't rock with me, and that's okay. Just I hope they realize that we're all part of the people, the proletariat, and we have to work together in order to achieve something. So whether they watch me or not, it's okay. But I hope that they get the message from RBN that we all need to come together and change the system for the better. And one of the things that we're trying to do is do that through our chapters and teaching people on the ground, which is very important. So I'm going to get going. This stream has went a lot longer than I wanted to, but thank you so much for hanging with me, everybody. I don't think there's any RBN shows happening today. I know Savvy on her channel is not doing anything today. She'll be back on Tuesday. I think she's doing a little staycation. And yeah, be sure to be on my channel for this Sunday. Actually, let me go to my channel really quick just to show you guys what I'll be talking about on Tuesday. All right. So, plus, I like my thumbnail. I like my thumbnails. I do them all myself. All right, so this is what I'll be talking about on my channel on Sunday. So Akile Enai from African People's Socialist Party will be on in this Tuesday. And then Nelson Betancourt is going to be talking about local public banks. So I can't wait to have them both on. Be here or be there or be square on Tuesday at 2, starting with Akile Enai. And then at 3 p.m. on that same stream, Nelson Betancourt will be in here. So I am excited. And I'll share the link just so in case y'all want to, come in and be like, hey, Jaybe, I was from RBN. I saw you. Come in and say what's up. Anywho, so yeah. Now, gotta go. Gotta get something to eat. At least get myself a snack before dinner time. And look, like I always say to everybody, by the way, thanks to Carlos Garrido for joining. Happy Father's Day to all the dads. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers that do double duty. Happy Father's Day to all the moms that do double duty. And anybody that is gender non-conforming parent, also happy day to you. All right. Thank you so very much to everybody. Look, water your plants, water yourselves. Leave the world better than you found it. Smoke them if you got them. Drink them if you got them. If you ain't got them, then watch something funny. Watch something hilarious, because joy is revolutionary. And by the way, whenever anybody tries to, spew anti-communist nonsense about Cuba, get, your information from people who are Cubans on the ground that know what they're talking about. People like Carlos Garrido, people like Azure Scapegoat. There's many different people. They're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're on YouTube, they're on Rockfin. They're everywhere. So look for them, to give the real deal about what's going on. And also justice for Mykaella, and also one of the things that I want to say to you guys is do the best you can on the ground, even if it's something small. You don't have to change the entire world. You just affect somebody's world even in a small way. That's leaving the world better than you found it, leaving somebody's world better than you found it, even in a small way. It could be just how you treat somebody with kindness. Do that. Forehead kisses to every single one of you. And if you're in Orlando, I'll see you real soon. And for all of you guys, see you on my channel on Tuesday. Love you.